Before we begin tonight's story, if you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review would mean the world to us. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. And of course, if you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing. It truly makes a difference. Tonight's story comes from a suggestion by Jeff Anon. Thank you, Jeff, for bringing this incredible mystery to our attention. Now, let's begin. The Vela Incident, the nuclear flash that officially never happened. September 22nd, 1979, 3:53 in the morning, Coordinated Universal Time, the southern Indian Ocean near the Prince Edward Islands. In the vast darkness above Earth's atmosphere, a United States military satellite recorded something that should not exist. A flash of light, then another, 2 pulses, milliseconds apart. Brilliant, unmistakable. The satellite was not experimental, it was not a prototype. It had been operating flawlessly for years, watching, waiting, scanning the entire surface of the planet for one specific thing: nuclear detonations. The satellite's designation was Vela 6911, and it had just detected what appeared to be an atomic explosion in one of the most remote regions of the planet. But here's the thing about that night, about that flash, about that moment in history. According to the United States government, it never happened. Not officially, not in any way that matters. And that impossibility, that contradiction between what the sensors saw and what the world was told, is where our story truly begins. Chapter 1. The Vela Satellite Program. To understand why the Vela flash matters, you first need to understand what the Vela satellites were built to do. 1963, the height of the Cold War. The United States, the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom had just signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, an agreement that prohibited nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere, in outer space and underwater. But treaties are only as good as the ability to verify them. How do you prove a nation isn't secretly detonating nuclear weapons in the middle of the ocean, in the depths of the Sahara, in the frozen wastelands of Antarctica? You watch. From space. The Vela satellite program was launched specifically for this purpose. The name Vela comes from the Spanish word meaning watchman, or to keep vigil. These satellites were the watchers, the guardians, the eyes that never blinked. Each Vela satellite carried an array of sensors designed to detect the unique signatures of nuclear explosions. Light sensors called pangmeters measured the intensity and pattern of light flashes. Gamma-ray detectors picked up high-energy radiation. X-ray sensors captured the initial burst of energy. Neutron detectors measured particle emissions. Together, these instruments could identify a nuclear detonation from 22,000 miles away in space. By 1979, the Vela program had been operating for 16 years. The satellites had successfully detected dozens of confirmed nuclear tests, from China to France to India. They had monitored underground tests that vented into the atmosphere. They had tracked Soviet weapons development. They had verified compliance with international treaties. And in all that time, across all those years, the Vela satellites had never once falsely identified a nuclear explosion. Their track record was perfect. Until September 22nd, 1979. Chapter 2. The signal that changed everything. The data came in at 03:53 Coordinated Universal Time. Vela 6911, orbiting high above the Indian Ocean, recorded a light signature that matched every single characteristic of a nuclear detonation. The signal showed what nuclear weapons analysts call a double hump light curve. First flash. The initial detonation, the moment the nuclear reaction begins and releases an enormous burst of light and energy. Brief darkness. A fraction of a second where the explosion's shockwave compresses the surrounding air, momentarily obscuring the fireball. Second flash. The fireball re-emerges, brighter than before, as it expands and the atmosphere becomes transparent again to the intense light. This double flash pattern is the signature of atmospheric nuclear explosions. It's not something you see in lightning strikes, not in meteor impacts, not in any natural phenomenon known to science. It's nuclear. Always nuclear. The light curve recorded by Vela 6911 matched known nuclear tests almost perfectly. The intensity was consistent with a yield between 2 and 3 kilotons, a tactical nuclear weapon, small by Cold War standards but devastating nonetheless. But the satellite data was only the beginning. Within hours, analysts began correlating information from other monitoring systems around the world. United States Navy hydrophones, underwater acoustic sensors designed to detect submarine movements and underwater explosions, had recorded anomalous signals in the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean regions around the same time as the flash. The acoustic patterns were consistent with a distant underwater disturbance, possibly an explosion. Weather monitoring stations in Australia detected unusual ionospheric disturbances, disruptions in the electrically charged layers of the upper atmosphere. Nuclear explosions create these disturbances. They're part of the signature. Multiple independent sensors, different technologies, different locations, all pointing to the same conclusion. Something had exploded, something nuclear, and it had happened in one of the most remote regions of Earth, far from prying eyes, far from civilian populations, far from the oversight of international observers. The data was routed immediately to the Pentagon, to the Central Intelligence Agency, to the Department of Energy, to the National Security Council. Within the classified corridors of American intelligence, panic began to spread. Because if this was a nuclear test, if someone had successfully detonated a nuclear weapon in secret, then the entire framework of nuclear non-proliferation had just collapsed. Chapter 3. Immediate panic inside the Pentagon. The initial assessment was blunt. Classified briefings circulated among defense analysts, intelligence officers, and military leadership. The consensus, at least in those first hours and days, was stark. This appeared to be a nuclear detonation. The question wasn't whether something had exploded. The question was who had done it. Analysts began compiling a list of suspects, nations with the capability, the motivation and the secrecy to pull off a clandestine nuclear test in the middle of the ocean. 2 names rose to the top, South Africa and Israel. South Africa in 1979 was an international pariah. The apartheid regime was facing increasing isolation, sanctions and condemnation. But it also had something most nations didn't have: uranium. Vast deposits of uranium ore, the raw material for nuclear weapons, and it had the industrial infrastructure to refine that uranium into weapons-grade material. Throughout the 1970s, South Africa had been quietly developing a nuclear weapons program. Western intelligence agencies knew this. They had satellite photos of the suspected facilities. They had intercepted communications. They had reports from defectors and informants. But South Africa needed to test. You can't build a nuclear arsenal without knowing your weapons actually work. And testing inside South Africa was impossible. Too many satellites, too many international observers, too much scrutiny. A remote ocean test, however, would be different. Isolated, plausibly deniable, especially if conducted at night in the middle of winter in the southern hemisphere, when weather conditions would obscure any visual evidence and disperse radioactive debris before sampling aircraft could arrive. Then there was Israel. Israel had never officially admitted to possessing nuclear weapons. The policy was called nuclear ambiguity, a deliberate strategy of neither confirming nor denying the existence of an Israeli nuclear arsenal. But Western intelligence agencies weren't ambiguous about it. They knew Israel had the bomb. Estimates suggested Israel had developed nuclear weapons as early as the late 1960s, possibly with assistance from France. The reactor at Dimona in the Negev desert was the centerpiece of the program. But like South Africa, Israel faced a problem. You can build weapons in secret. You can develop the infrastructure, refine the materials, assemble the devices. But at some point, if you want a credible deterrent, you need to know they work. And testing inside Israel was unthinkable. Too small, too densely populated, too close to hostile neighbours who would immediately detect and exploit any nuclear test for propaganda and diplomatic purposes. What Israel needed was a partner, a nation with remote territory, a nation with shared interests, a nation also developing nuclear weapons and facing international isolation. South Africa fit perfectly. By the late 1970s, Israel and South Africa had developed close military ties, arms sales, intelligence sharing, joint development programs, and, according to multiple intelligence assessments, nuclear cooperation. A joint Israeli-South African nuclear test in the remote Southern Ocean would serve both nations' interests. Israel would get verification that its weapons worked. South Africa would benefit from Israeli technical expertise. Both could maintain plausible deniability. The location of the Vela flash, somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean or South Atlantic, was consistent with this theory. Remote, international waters, far from major shipping lanes, close enough to South African territory for logistical support, but far enough to maintain deniability. Everything fit. The intelligence community's assessment was clear. The Vela flash was most likely a clandestine nuclear test conducted by South Africa, possibly in cooperation with Israel. But confirming this publicly would create an immediate crisis. It would mean a nation had violated the Limited Test Ban Treaty. It would mean the nuclear non-proliferation regime was failing. It would mean new nations were joining the nuclear club outside the established framework. And it would mean the United States would be forced to take action, impose sanctions, possibly trigger a broader diplomatic crisis at a time when the Carter administration was already struggling with crises in Iran, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, with an energy crisis at home. The political calculation was brutal. Confirming the truth would cause more problems than it would solve. So instead of making a definitive announcement, the White House made a different decision. Order a review, form a panel, re-examine the data, and find a way to make this problem disappear. Chapter 4. The Carter administration intervenes. President Jimmy Carter was briefed on the Vela incident within days of the flash. Years later, after leaving office, Carter would discuss the incident in interviews and in his personal writings. His recollection was telling. He believed, at least initially, that the flash was a nuclear test. The data was compelling. The intelligence assessments were consistent. Everything pointed to a real detonation. But Carter also understood the implications. If the United States confirmed that a nation had conducted a secret nuclear test, it would trigger a cascade of consequences. International treaties would be violated. The United Nations would demand investigations. Sanctions would have to be imposed. Diplomatic relationships would be strained. And in 1979, the Carter administration was already dealing with multiple crises. The Iranian Revolution had just toppled the Shah. American hostages would soon be seized in Tehran. The Soviet Union was about to invade Afghanistan. The global balance of power was shifting. Adding a nuclear crisis to the mix was politically untenable, so the decision was made. Instead of announcing that a nuclear test had occurred, the administration would form a special scientific panel to review the data and determine if there could be any alternative explanation. The goal wasn't necessarily to find the truth. The goal was to find doubt, to create enough scientific ambiguity that the United States could avoid making a definitive statement, to buy time, space, and diplomatic flexibility. The panel would be led by a man named Jack Ruina, a former Pentagon scientist and arms control expert, someone with credibility in the scientific community and experience navigating the intersection of science and policy. The panel's official mandate was to determine whether the Vela signal could have been caused by something other than a nuclear explosion. And over the following months, that's exactly what they tried to do. Chapter 5. The Ruina Panel. The Ruina Panel began its work in late 1979 and continued into 1980. The task was straightforward on paper: examine all available data and determine the most likely explanation for the Vela flash. But the political pressure was enormous. The panel reviewed the satellite data, the light curves, the sensor readings. They examined the hydroacoustic signals from Navy listening stations. They analysed weather patterns, ionospheric data, and astronomical records, and they began proposing alternative explanations. Could it have been a meteor, a small asteroid entering the atmosphere at just the right angle, with just the right composition, to produce a double flash? Possible. but meteor specialists pointed out that meteors don't produce the specific double hump pattern seen in nuclear explosions, and the probability of a meteor strike occurring at precisely the location and time to mimic a nuclear signature was vanishingly small. Could it have been lightning? A rare atmospheric phenomenon, perhaps a massive superbolt that somehow triggered the sensors? Again, possible in theory, but lightning doesn't create the same spectral signatures as nuclear explosions. The light from lightning has a different colour distribution, a different intensity pattern, a different temporal profile. Could it have been a sensor malfunction? Perhaps Vela 6911 had experienced a technical failure, generating false readings? But the satellite had been functioning perfectly before and after the incident, and other monitoring systems had detected anomalies at the same time. Multiple independent. Sensors don't malfunction simultaneously in ways that all mimic a nuclear explosion. The panel considered and rejected numerous hypotheses, and yet when the final report was released in the summer of 1980, the conclusion was carefully worded. The panel stated that the signal was probably not from a nuclear explosion. Not definitely not. Not conclusively ruled out. Probably not. The report acknowledged that no definitive alternative explanation had been found. It admitted that the signal resembled a nuclear detonation, but it suggested that unusual atmospheric conditions, combined with possible sensor anomalies, could have created a false positive. The conclusion was deliberately vague, designed to create just enough doubt to allow the government to avoid making a firm declaration. And with that report, the official position of the United States government became clear. The Vela incident was not a nuclear test. Case closed. Except the case was far from closed. Chapter 6. The scientists who disagreed. Not everyone accepted the Ruiner panel's conclusion. Richard Garwin, one of the most respected physicists in America, a man who had helped design the hydrogen bomb, publicly disputed the findings. Garwin reviewed the data independently and concluded that the signal strongly supported a nuclear test. He argued that the double flash pattern, the intensity, the duration, all matched known nuclear explosions. He challenged the panel to provide a credible alternative explanation, and when none was offered, he stood by his assessment. Other scientists joined the dissent. They pointed out that the Vela satellites had operated for 16 years without a single false positive, suggesting that this one incident was a sensor error required believing in an extraordinary coincidence. They noted that independent monitoring systems had detected anomalies consistent with a nuclear explosion. The probability that all of these systems would simultaneously malfunction or misinterpret natural phenomena in precisely the same way was statistically absurd. They questioned the political motivations behind the panel's conclusion, suggesting that the vague language was designed to provide diplomatic cover rather than scientific clarity. But the dissent was largely ignored. The mainstream media accepted the government's position. The Vela incident faded from public attention, and the official narrative remained unchanged. It was not a nuclear test. It was something else, something unexplained, but definitely not nuclear. And that's where the story might have ended, buried in classified files and forgotten by history, except the evidence kept surfacing. Chapter 7. The scientists who paid the price. Richard Garwin wasn't just any physicist voicing concerns. He was a legend in the nuclear weapons community, a man who had designed the first hydrogen bomb alongside Edward Teller, a scientific advisor to multiple presidents, a voice that carried weight in the highest levels of government, and after the Vela incident his career trajectory changed. Garwin continued to publicly dispute the Ruiner panel's findings throughout 1980 and into 1981. He gave interviews, he published papers, he testified before congressional committees when given the chance. He argued repeatedly and forcefully that the scientific evidence supported a nuclear test, and that the government's conclusion was politically motivated rather than scientifically sound. And slowly, quietly, he found himself being excluded from certain briefings. Invitations to consult on sensitive projects became less frequent. Security clearances that had been routinely renewed for decades suddenly required additional reviews. Nothing overt, nothing that could be called retaliation. But the message was clear. There were some truths you didn't challenge publicly. Other scientists who had expressed doubts about the official narrative experienced similar treatment. Panel members who had dissented from the majority conclusion, whose names appeared in footnotes of the classified version of the Rowena report, found their future government contracts mysteriously delayed or denied. Academic researchers who published papers questioning the meteor or lightning hypotheses discovered that funding for their work became harder to secure. The mechanism wasn't conspiracy. It was bureaucratic pressure, subtle, deniable, effective. Because in the world of classified science, access is everything, and access is controlled by people who value loyalty to the institution over loyalty to truth. One former Defense Department analyst, speaking decades later under condition of anonymity, described the atmosphere in the months following the panel's conclusion. "We all knew what the data showed," he said. "We'd all seen nuclear test signatures before. This was nuclear. But the decision had been made at the highest levels that we weren't going to confirm it. And if you wanted to keep working on nuclear issues, if you wanted to keep your clearance, you learned not to push too hard." The chilling effect was real. Scientists stopped asking questions, researchers moved on to other topics, and the official narrative solidified, not because it was scientifically sound, but because challenging it had become professionally dangerous. Chapter 8. The search that was designed to fail. The story of the search for radioactive debris is even more troubling when you examine the details. Standard protocol for suspected nuclear events was well established by 1979. Detection, assessment, immediate deployment of sampling aircraft to collect air samples and particulate matter. Speed was essential. Radioactive debris from atmospheric nuclear tests disperses rapidly. Within hours, it can spread over hundreds of miles. Within days, it can circle the globe at high altitudes. Within weeks, it becomes so diluted that detection is nearly impossible. The Air Force had specialised aircraft ready for exactly this mission. Blue C-135 Constant Phoenix planes, flying laboratories equipped with filters and sensors designed to collect and analyse airborne radioactive particles. These planes were deployed regularly during the Cold War to sample Soviet and Chinese nuclear tests. They knew the protocols, they knew the urgency. So when did they deploy after the Vela flash? The first sampling missions didn't launch until nearly a week after the event. A week! By that time, any debris would have been scattered across vast areas of the southern hemisphere, diluted by weather systems mixed with natural background radiation. And the search area was enormous. The Vela satellite could pinpoint the flash to within hundreds of miles, but that still left a search zone covering hundreds of thousands of square miles of empty ocean. The sampling flights conducted a handful of passes over the suspected region. They collected air samples at various altitudes. They analysed filters for radioactive particles, and officially, they found nothing definitive. But here's where the story gets strange. Flight logs from those missions, partially declassified years later, show unusual patterns. Some flights were routed through areas that seemed inconsistent with the satellite data. They sampled regions north of the suspected detonation site, when prevailing winds would have carried debris southeast. Flight durations were shorter than standard protocols required. Missions that should have lasted 8 to 10 hours were completed in 4 to 6. And most tellingly, some of the collected samples were never fully analysed. A former Air Force technician who worked on the sampling program spoke to researchers in the 2000s, decades after the event. He described receiving samples from the southern Indian Ocean missions and being told to conduct only preliminary analysis. Normally, we'd run every test available, he explained. Full spectrum analysis, isotope identification, the works. With these samples, we were told to do a basic check and move on. It was unusual. It felt like they didn't want us to find anything. Was the search deliberately sabotaged? Or was it simply a case of bureaucratic delay and inadequate resources? The answer depends on how much you trust official explanations, but the fact remains. The search for radioactive debris was conducted in a manner that virtually guaranteed nothing would be found, even if debris existed. Chapter 9. The document that changed everything. Of all the declassified materials related to the Vela incident, one document stands out. It was released in 2006, more than 25 years after the event, as part of a batch of previously classified CIA intelligence assessments. The document is dated October 15th, 1979, just 3 weeks after the flash. The title, Assessment of Anomalous Signal Detected by Vela Satellite on September 22, 1979. The assessment is 12 pages long. Most of it is technical analysis, reviewing the sensor data, comparing the signal to known nuclear tests, discussing the double flash pattern. But on page 9, there's a section titled Most Likely Explanation, and the language is stark. This agency assesses with high confidence that the signal detected by Vela 6911 on September 22, 1979, was caused by a nuclear explosion. The optical signature, intensity profile, and temporal characteristics are consistent with an atmospheric or near-surface detonation in the 2 to 4 kiloton range. It continues, we assess with moderate confidence that the test was conducted by the Republic of South Africa, possibly in cooperation with Israel. Both nations have motives to conduct clandestine testing, access to remote maritime regions suitable for such a test, and established patterns of military cooperation that would facilitate joint operations. The document then discusses the political implications. Public confirmation of this assessment would likely require the United States to impose sanctions on South Africa and potentially strain relations with Israel. Given current geopolitical priorities and the lack of direct evidence that could withstand international scrutiny, this agency recommends that definitive attribution be avoided pending further investigation. In other words, the CIA knew. They assessed it was nuclear. They identified the likely perpetrators. And they recommended keeping it quiet for political reasons. The document was classified top secret at the time. It was not shared with the public. It was not given to the press. It was not acknowledged in official statements. Instead, the Ruiner panel was convened, and a more politically palatable conclusion was reached. When this document was finally declassified in 2006, it received minimal media attention. A few articles in specialised publications, a brief mention in some defence journals. But it fundamentally undermines the official narrative, because it proves that the ambiguity was manufactured. The government knew what happened. They just chose not to tell anyone. Chapter 10. The naval officer who heard the bomb in 2012, a retired United States Navy officer, came forward with his own account of the Vela incident. His name was Commander James Howell, retired. He had served as a sonar technician aboard a Navy surveillance ship operating in the southern Atlantic in late 1979. Howell's ship was equipped with advanced underwater listening equipment, part of the Navy's sound surveillance system, a network of hydrophones designed to track Soviet submarines. On the night of September 22, 1979, Howell was on duty when the hydrophones detected an unusual signal. In an interview with a documentary filmmaker, Howell described what he heard. It wasn't like anything we'd encountered before. We tracked submarine launches, underwater explosions from depth charges during exercises, all kinds of acoustic phenomena. This was different. It was a single, massive pressure wave. Sharp onset. Long decay. The acoustic signature was consistent with a large explosion, but not underwater. It was more like something detonating just above the surface or in the lower atmosphere, creating a shock wave that propagated through the water. Howell and his team logged the signal and reported it through normal channels. Within hours, they received orders to seal their logs and not discuss the detection with anyone outside their chain of command. We all knew what that meant, Howell said. Something big had happened, and someone high up didn't want it talked about. Weeks later, Howell's commander was quietly reassigned. The sonar logs from that night were collected and removed from the ship. The crew was reminded of their security obligations and told that discussing the incident could result in charges under the Espionage Act. Howell kept quiet for more than 30 years. He followed orders, he maintained his clearance, he served honourably, and retired with full benefits. But after reading about the declassified CIA documents and the ongoing debate about the Vela incident, he decided to speak. "I'm in my 70s now," he said. "I don't care about clearances anymore. I don't care about protecting bureaucratic secrets. I know what I heard. We detected an explosion, and the government knew about it and covered it up. People deserve to know the truth." Howell's account corroborates the satellite data, the CIA assessment, and the conclusions of scientists like Richard Garwin. Multiple independent systems detected the same event, and all of them were dismissed, classified, or explained away. Chapter 11. The Israel Connection. In the years and decades following the Vela incident, declassified documents began to paint a more detailed picture of what intelligence agencies actually believed. Internal CIA memos from the period referred to the event as the South Atlantic Flash, treating it not as a mystery, but as a known event with unclear attribution. One memo, declassified in the 1990s, stated plainly that the flash was probably a nuclear test, and that the most likely suspects were South Africa and Israel, possibly in cooperation. Other documents revealed that American intelligence had been tracking Israeli-South African military cooperation closely throughout the 1970s. Arms shipments, technology transfers, joint exercises, and nuclear collaboration. In 1977, 2 years before the Vela incident, Soviet satellites had photographed what appeared to be preparations for a nuclear test in the Kalahari Desert in South Africa. International pressure, led by the United States, forced South Africa to abandon the test. But the program didn't end. It went underground, or rather, it went out to sea. Israel had compelling reasons to want a nuclear test. Deterrence against hostile neighbours required credibility, and credibility required proof that your weapons actually worked. But Israel also needed deniability. Open testing would destroy the policy of nuclear ambiguity and trigger international condemnation, possibly military retaliation from Arab states. A joint test with South Africa in international waters solved both problems. Israel would get confirmation. South Africa would advance its program. Both could deny responsibility. The logistics would have been complex but manageable. A small nuclear device could be placed on a ship or barge, towed to a remote location, and detonated underwater or in the air just above the surface. Timing the test to coincide with poor weather in the southern hemisphere winter would help disperse radioactive debris and reduce the chances of detection by sampling aircraft. And conducting the test at night, when most surveillance assets were less effective, provided an additional layer of concealment. The Vela flash occurred in the middle of the southern hemisphere winter, at night, in a remote region of the ocean where South African ships had legitimate reasons to operate. Every piece of circumstantial evidence pointed to a planned, executed, and successfully concealed nuclear test. But officially, nothing had happened. Chapter 12. The missing radiation. One of the key arguments used to dispute the nuclear test hypothesis was the lack of detected radioactive fallout. If a nuclear weapon had detonated, the argument went, radioactive debris would have been dispersed into the atmosphere and eventually detected by sampling aircraft or ground-based monitoring stations. But no radioactive debris was officially confirmed. This absence of evidence became evidence of absence in the official narrative. Except the story of the search for radioactive debris is itself suspicious. Sampling missions were delayed. By the time aircraft were dispatched to the region, several days had passed. Weather patterns had shifted. Any debris would have been dispersed over vast areas of the ocean. The search area was enormous, covering hundreds of thousands of square miles. The sampling flights were limited in number and duration. The likelihood of finding dispersed radioactive particles in such a vast area days after the event was minimal. And then there's the question of what was actually found and what was reported. Some researchers have pointed to thyroid abnormalities detected in sheep in parts of Australia in the months following the Vela incident. Thyroid problems in livestock are a known indicator of exposure to radioactive iodine, a common byproduct of nuclear fission. Australian scientists at the time noted the anomalies but couldn't definitively link them to the Vela flash. The data was inconclusive, complicated by other possible sources of contamination, but the fact remains, The absence of detected radiation doesn't prove there was no nuclear explosion. It proves that sampling efforts were delayed, limited, and possibly insufficient to detect what was there. Conspiracy theorists go further. They argue that detection was avoided intentionally, that the delays were deliberate, that evidence was found but suppressed to maintain diplomatic stability. They point to the geopolitical stakes. Confirming the test would have forced the United States to impose sanctions on South Africa, a key anti-communist ally in southern Africa during the Cold War. It would have strained relationships with Israel, America's closest ally in the Middle East. The cost of confirmation was too high. So the evidence, if it existed, was buried, and the official narrative remained intact. Chapter 13. Declassified documents complete the picture. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, as Cold War documents were gradually declassified, the official story of the Vela incident began to crack. Internal government memos revealed deep divisions within the intelligence community about the nature of the event. Some agencies believed it was definitely a nuclear test. Others were more cautious, but acknowledged the evidence was compelling. Almost no one genuinely believed the alternative explanations proposed by the Ruina panel. One particularly revealing document was a CIA intelligence assessment from 1980. The report, declassified decades later, stated that the agency had high confidence the flash was a nuclear explosion, and moderate confidence that it was conducted by South Africa, possibly with Israeli involvement. The same document noted that the Ruina panel's conclusion was inconsistent with the technical data and appeared to be influenced by policy considerations rather than scientific analysis. In other words, the CIA believed the panel's conclusion was politically motivated. Another document from the Defense Intelligence Agency assessed that the event had all the characteristics of a nuclear test, and that no plausible alternative explanation exists. These assessments were classified for years. The public was told one story. The intelligence community believed another. But even with these revelations, no official reversal ever came. The government never issued a corrected statement. No press conference was held to admit the truth. No formal acknowledgement was made. The official position remained unchanged. The Vela flash was probably not a nuclear test, and in the absence of definitive proof, the ambiguity persists. Chapter 14. The modern implications. The Vela incident isn't just a Cold War mystery, it's a precedent, and that precedent echoes through every nuclear crisis we face today. When North Korea conducts underground nuclear tests and the international community debates the evidence, the Vela incident hangs in the background. Because if a nation could conduct a nuclear test in 1979 and avoid consequences through official ambiguity, why couldn't North Korea do the same? North Korea has conducted 6 acknowledged nuclear tests between 2006 and 2017. Each time, seismic sensors detect the underground explosions. Each time, the international community condemns the tests. Each time, sanctions are imposed. But what about tests that aren't acknowledged? What about smaller, more carefully concealed detonations that could be attributed to earthquakes or mining explosions? The Vela incident proved that with enough political will, evidence can be dismissed, findings can be disputed, and the truth can be buried under layers of official doubt. When Western intelligence agencies assess Iran's nuclear program, they're operating in the shadow of the Vela incident. Iran insists its nuclear program is peaceful. International inspectors monitor declared facilities. Intelligence agencies watch for signs of weaponization. But everyone involved knows that detection systems can be evaded, that tests can be concealed, that even when evidence exists, political considerations can prevent acknowledgement. The precedent set in 1979 taught nations around the world a valuable lesson. If you're careful enough, if you choose your location wisely, if you have the right political cover, you can test a nuclear weapon and get away with it. And that lesson has implications for the future of nuclear non-proliferation. How do you enforce treaties when evidence can be disputed? How do you maintain deterrence when tests can be denied? How do you prevent proliferation when the consequences of detection are negotiable? The Vela incident didn't just change history, It changed the rules of the game, and we're still playing by those rules today. In recent years, there have been mysterious seismic events that some analysts believe could be covert nuclear tests. Small seismic disturbances in remote regions, acoustic anomalies detected by monitoring stations, radiation measurements that spike and then disappear. Each time, the official explanation is natural phenomena, earthquakes, mining activity, instrument errors, and each time skeptics point back to the Vela incident. Because if the most sophisticated nuclear detection system ever built could record a nuclear explosion and have that explosion officially dismissed, what's to stop it from happening again? The technology has improved since 1979. The monitoring networks are more extensive, the sensors are more sensitive, but the political calculations remain the same. Sometimes confirming the truth causes more problems than maintaining ambiguity, and that's the legacy of the Vela incident. Not just what happened on September 22nd, 1979, but what it taught the world about the gap between evidence and acknowledgement, between detection and confirmation, between what we know and what we're willing to admit. Chapter 15. Why the Truth Still Matters. More than 4 decades have passed since the Vela incident. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union collapsed. South Africa abandoned its nuclear weapons program in the early 1990s and dismantled its arsenal. Israel still maintains its policy of nuclear ambiguity, but is widely acknowledged to possess a substantial nuclear arsenal. So why does the Vela incident still matter? Because the implications extend far beyond that single flash in 1979. If the Vela incident was a nuclear test, it means a nation successfully violated international law and got away with it. It means the framework of nuclear non-proliferation, the treaties and monitoring systems designed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, failed at a critical moment. It means the United States government knowingly covered up that failure for political reasons, prioritising diplomatic convenience over transparency and accountability. And it means that other nations, watching and learning from this precedent, understood that clandestine nuclear tests are possible, that with enough planning, enough secrecy, enough political cover, you can test a nuclear weapon and avoid consequences. But if the Vela incident was not a nuclear test, if the government's explanation is accurate, then the implications are equally troubling. It means the most sophisticated nuclear detection system ever built failed. Once, and only once. It means that a sensor array that had operated flawlessly for 16 years, that had never produced a false positive, somehow malfunctioned in a way that perfectly mimicked a nuclear explosion. It means that multiple independent monitoring systems simultaneously detected anomalies that collectively suggested a nuclear event, but all were wrong. It means that scientists still cannot definitively explain what happened. Either answer is disturbing. Either we live in a world where nuclear tests can be hidden and covered up, or we live in a world where our best monitoring systems can fail in catastrophic and unexplained ways. Both possibilities undermine confidence in the global non-proliferation regime. Both suggest that the systems designed to keep us safe from nuclear threats are more fragile than we'd like to believe. Chapter 16. The Witnesses Who Disappeared. Over the years, researchers and journalists have tried to track down the people who were directly involved in the Vela incident response, the satellite operators who first received the data, the intelligence analysts who wrote the initial assessments, the Navy personnel who detected the acoustic signals, the Air Force pilots who flew the sampling missions. Many are deceased, others retired and disappeared from public view. Some signed lifetime non-disclosure agreements that prevent them from speaking, but a few have come forward, usually near the end of their lives, when the weight of the secret becomes heavier than the consequences of speaking. In 2015, a former satellite data analyst named Patricia Hendricks gave an interview to a researcher investigating the Vela incident. Hendricks had worked at the Air Force Technical Application Center in the early 1980s, reviewing satellite data and writing assessments for military leadership. She had access to the classified files on the Vela flash. The original reports were definitive, she said. There was no ambiguity in the technical analysis. It was a nuclear detonation. The only debate was about attribution, who had done it, and whether we could prove it. Hendricks described the pressure analysts felt to soften their conclusions. We were told to find alternative explanations, to emphasise uncertainty, to avoid definitive statements. It wasn't about the science anymore. It was about what the White House wanted to hear. When asked if she believed the official conclusion, Hendricks laughed. No one who actually looked at the data believed it was anything other than nuclear. But we had careers to protect, families to support. You learn to write reports that say what you're supposed to say, even when you know it's not true. Another witness, a former CIA officer named Thomas Reynolds, spoke to journalists in 2018, shortly before his death from cancer. Reynolds had been stationed in the Middle East in the late 1970s, monitoring Israeli military activities. We knew about the cooperation with South Africa, he said. We had reports of Israeli technicians working at South African facilities. We intercepted communications discussing joint projects. When the Vela flash happened, everyone in the intelligence community immediately suspected Israel and South Africa. Reynolds described the decision-making process in the weeks after the incident. The question wasn't whether it was nuclear. The question was whether we could afford to confirm it. Israel was our most important ally in the region. South Africa was a key anti-communist partner in Africa. Confirming the test would have required sanctions, diplomatic consequences, maybe even criminal investigations. The decision was made to classify the evidence, bury the conclusions and move on. It was Cold War realism. Sometimes the truth is less important than stability. These witnesses, speaking decades after the event, paint a consistent picture. The truth was known, the evidence was clear, and the decision was made to conceal it. Final chapter. The flash that won't go away. The Vela incident occupies a unique space in the landscape of Cold War mysteries. It's not a UFO sighting, easily dismissed as misidentification or imagination. It's not a conspiracy theory built on speculation and circumstantial evidence. It's a documented event, recorded by multiple sophisticated sensors, analysed by some of the best scientists in the world, discussed in classified government documents, and yet it remains unresolved. No natural explanation satisfies the physicists who have studied the data. Meteor impacts don't create double flashes. Lightning doesn't produce the right spectral signature. Sensor malfunctions don't explain corroborating data from independent systems. No government has ever admitted responsibility. South Africa dismantled its nuclear program without confirming or denying the test. Israel maintains its policy of nuclear ambiguity. The United States sticks to its vague assessment that the event was probably not nuclear. No new evidence has emerged to close the case definitively. The radioactive debris, if it existed, is long gone. The ships or platforms that might have been used are likely destroyed or repurposed. The personnel involved are aging or deceased. The Vela incident exists in a perfect grey zone of uncertainty. Too real to dismiss as fantasy, too dangerous to confirm as fact. And that ambiguity, that deliberate cultivation of doubt may be exactly the point. Because some truths are too inconvenient to acknowledge. Some facts are too disruptive to admit. Some flashes of light are too bright to look at directly. On September 22nd, 1979, at 3:53 in the morning Coordinated Universal Time, something happened over the southern Indian Ocean. A satellite saw it. Sensors recorded it. Analysts studied it. And the world was told it didn't matter. But it did matter. It still matters. Because that flash, that brief moment of light captured by Vela 6911, represents something fundamental about the nuclear age. The gap between what we know and what we're told. The space between truth and politics. The moment when evidence meets denial, and denial wins. The Vela incident is a reminder that not all mysteries are solved. Not all questions are answered. And not all lights in the darkness are meant to be explained. Some are meant to be forgotten. But the flash over the Indian Ocean refuses to go away. It remains in the historical record, in declassified files, in scientific journals, in the memories of those who studied the data and knew what they had seen. It remains as a testament to the fragility of truth in a world where power and secrecy often matter more than facts. And it remains as a question that will never be fully answered. What happened on September 22nd, 1979? Was it a nuclear test? Or was it something else? The answer depends on who you ask, and who you choose to believe. But the light that flashed over the ocean that night was real. The sensors that detected it were real. The scientists who analysed it were real. And the cover-up, whether motivated by politics or prudence, was real too. The Vela incident happened. What it means, what it represents, what it tells us about nuclear weapons and government secrecy, and the nature of truth in the modern world is still being debated. And perhaps that's exactly how it was meant to be. A flash of light, a moment of truth, and then darkness. Questions without answers, evidence without confirmation, a mystery that exists in the space between what we saw and what we were allowed to know. The flash over the Indian Ocean, the nuclear explosion that officially never happened, and the reminder that sometimes the most important truths are the ones we're never told. But here's what we do know for certain. On September 22nd, 1979, the most sophisticated nuclear detection system ever built recorded an event consistent with a nuclear explosion. Multiple independent sensors corroborated the detection. The United States intelligence community assessed with high confidence that the event was nuclear. Scientists who analysed the data concluded it matched known nuclear test signatures, and the official conclusion was probably not a nuclear explosion. That gap, that chasm between evidence and acknowledgement, tells us everything we need to know about how governments handle inconvenient truths. It tells us that detection doesn't guarantee disclosure, that evidence doesn't guarantee acknowledgement, that sometimes the machinery of power decides that ambiguity serves the national interest better than truth. The Vela incident is a case study in institutional denial, not the denial of conspiracy theorists who reject all official narratives, but the denial of institutions that shape official narratives to serve political ends. The scientists knew, the analysts knew, the intelligence officers knew, but the public was told something different. And that difference matters, because we live in a world where nuclear weapons exist, where nations pursue them in secret, where tests can be concealed and evidence can be disputed. The Vela incident is a warning. Not about what happened in 1979, but about what continues to happen every time evidence is classified, conclusions are softened, and inconvenient truths are buried beneath layers of official ambiguity. The flash over the southern Indian Ocean was real. What it means for nuclear non-proliferation, for international security, for the reliability of our detection systems, remains unresolved. And perhaps that's the most frightening thing of all. Not the explosion itself, but the fact that we still don't know, officially, whether it even happened. Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content and want to help the channel grow, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps us more than you could possibly know, and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us all awake at night. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It's incredible to know we have listeners from every corner of the globe. Now, let's get into it. MK Ultra. The file. They never meant to find. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of grey Boston day when the sky pressed down like a wet blanket, and the smell of rain mixed with rotting leaves filled the air. Investigative journalist Eli Jones lived in a converted brownstone in Boston's South End 3rd floor, the kind of place where the radiators clanked all winter and the floorboards creaked with every step. His neighbours were the usual urban mix, a couple of grad students below him, a retired teacher across the hall who played opera too loud on Sunday mornings, and a rotating cast of young professionals who never stayed longer than their lease required. People kept to themselves here. That was the unspoken rule. You didn't ask questions. You didn't get involved. That morning, Eli had been up since 5, working on a piece about defence contractor fraud. 3 cups of coffee deep and running on maybe 4 hours of sleep. At 42, he'd been doing this long enough to know that the best stories came from the documents nobody wanted you to see. The sources who called from payphones. The patterns that emerged when you stared at spreadsheets until your eyes burned. He'd built a reputation over 2 decades. The guy who didn't let go. The journalist who'd spent 6 months tracking down a single witness for a story about police corruption. Who'd gone through 10,000 pages of court documents to expose a judge taking bribes. Who'd lost a marriage and 2 jobs because he couldn't walk away from a lead, even when every rational part of his brain told him to. His ex-wife Jennifer used to say he had a compulsion. You don't investigate stories, Eli. You disappear into them. She'd left 5 years ago. He couldn't blame her. The knock came at 7:15, but when he opened the door, no one was there. Just a package on the doormat, wrapped in brown paper that felt old and soft, like it had been handled many times before being delivered to him. No stamps, no postage mark, no return address. Just his name written in careful block letters across the wrapping, the ink slightly faded as if it had been sitting somewhere for a while before making its way to his door. Inside his apartment, with the morning light struggling through grimy windows, he unwrapped it slowly. Years of journalistic instinct made him careful with potential evidence. He photographed the package from multiple angles before opening it. Inside he found 2 items. The first was a storage unit key, brass and worn smooth with age, with a number stamped into the metal, 39. The kind of key that had been copied and used countless times, the grooves worn just slightly out of spec. The second was an index card, yellowed with age, the edges soft and curled like old book pages. Typewritten across its face were 2 lines in a font that screamed mid-20th century. That distinctive, slightly uneven pressure of manual typewriter keys. Storage Unit 39, Cambridge. You don't know the truth yet. And below that, a signature in fading blue ink that made his stomach drop. Sidney Gottlieb. Eli stood in his kitchen for a full 5 minutes, holding the card up to the light, turning it over in his hands, looking for any sign that this was a prank or a setup, or some elaborate piece of performance art. Sidney Gottlieb was real. More than real. He was infamous among the small community of journalists and historians who studied the darker corners of Cold War intelligence operations. The chemist with a club foot who'd run the CIA's MK-Ultra program. The man who'd authorized experiments that destroyed lives, shattered minds, left a trail of suicide and madness in the name of national security. The man who died in early 2002 in some small house in Virginia, having spent his final years tending goats and denying nothing because, as he'd said in one of his rare interviews, he'd done what he believed was necessary at the time. 20 years dead. So how did someone sign his name on this card? Eli made another pot of coffee. He called in sick to the magazine he was freelancing for. He spent 2 hours searching online for any recent mention of Sidney Gottlieb, any conspiracy theories about faked deaths or secret programs, anything that might explain what he was holding. Nothing. At noon, he grabbed his coat and headed for Cambridge. The storage facility sat off Massachusetts Avenue, tucked between a Korean restaurant that advertised authentic homestyle cooking and an auto body shop where 3 men in coveralls stood around smoking cigarettes and ignoring a car with its hood up. The storage place was called Secure Space, which seemed almost comically bland. A 3-story concrete building painted industrial beige with a logo that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. The front office smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. A woman in her 50s sat behind a desk reading a thriller novel with a lurid cover, a portable heater running at her feet despite the office being uncomfortably warm. Eli showed her the key. She barely looked up from her book. Unit 39 is in the back corner, 2nd floor, elevator's broken, so you'll have to take the stairs. How long has this unit been rented? Now she looked at him, her expression shifting from bored to mildly suspicious. Why? Just curious. I inherited some things from a relative. She turned to her computer, clicked around for a moment. since 1998, paid through the end of next year, automatic bank transfer every December. 24 years. Someone had been paying for this storage unit for nearly a quarter century. The name on the account? Eli asked. Can't give out that information. Privacy policy. He nodded, thanked her, and headed inside. The air inside the facility was stale and cold, with that particular smell of concrete and metal, and things left undisturbed for too long. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, half of them flickering in a way that made the hallways feel unstable, like the building itself was uncertain about remaining solid. Eli's footsteps echoed on the concrete stairs as he climbed to the second level. The stairwell was painted institutional green, the walls marked with scuffs and scratches from decades of people moving furniture and boxes, living their lives in transitions and storage. The hallway on the second floor stretched ahead, dimly lit by those same flickering fluorescents. Unit numbers were stencilled on rolling metal doors, 28, 30, 32, continuing down into the deeper part of the building where the natural light from the front windows couldn't reach. Unit 39 was at the very end, tucked into a corner where the hallway dead-ended. The padlock was heavy-duty, the kind made to resist bolt cutters, but the brass keys slid in smoothly and turned without resistance. The door rolled up with a metallic screech that made him wince. Inside was darkness. He felt along the wall until he found a pull chain for an overhead bulb. The light came on weak and yellow, barely illuminating the space. 10 by 10 feet. Cardboard boxes stacked floor to ceiling along 3 walls. File folders, binders, old reel-to-reel tape cases in faded cardboard boxes, a dented filing cabinet in the corner, its drawers slightly ajar as if someone had left in a hurry and hadn't bothered to close them completely. The smell was overwhelming. Old paper, dust, the faint chemical scent of decaying film and magnetic tape. And in the centre of it all, sitting on top of a cardboard box like it had been placed there deliberately, staged for him to find, was a manila folder with a single label typed on a piece of paper that had been taped to the front. Sub-Project 708. Eli's hands were shaking as he picked it up. The folder was thick, maybe 2 inches of documents, the edges of the papers inside stained and brittle with age. He opened it, and the world he thought he understood began to unravel. The program they admitted to. To understand what Eli found that day, sitting on the concrete floor of a storage unit while afternoon shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped, you first have to understand what the government already confessed to. Not willingly, never willingly. MK Ultra was born in April of 1953, during the height of Cold War paranoia, when every Soviet advance seemed like an existential threat, and every intelligence gap felt like a potential catastrophe waiting to happen. CIA Director Alan Dulles authorised the program, but it was Sidney Gottlieb who ran it, a chemist with a brilliant mind, a pronounced limp from childhood polio, and a belief that the human mind could be broken down and rebuilt like any other machine. The program's stated purpose was simple: develop mind control techniques that could counter Soviet brainwashing methods. American soldiers had come back from Korean prison camps saying things they shouldn't say, confessing to war crimes that hadn't happened, parroting communist propaganda like they'd been programmed. The agency was terrified that the Soviets had discovered some technique, some method of breaking human will and rebuilding it, and that America was falling behind in yet another arms race, this one taking place inside the human skull. But fear doesn't excuse what happened next. Under Gottlieb's direction, the CIA conducted experiments on thousands of unwitting subjects. They dosed them with LSD without consent, sometimes for days or weeks at a time. They subjected them to electroshock therapy calibrated to erase memories. They locked them in sensory deprivation tanks until their sense of self began to dissolve. They deprived them of sleep until hallucinations became indistinguishable from reality. They used psychological torture disguised as research, breaking minds in the name of protecting democracy. They funded experiments at universities, hospitals and prisons, using sub-projects that numbered in the hundreds, each one exploring a different aspect of human consciousness and control. Each one documented with clinical precision, at least initially. before someone decided that maybe keeping detailed records of illegal human experimentation wasn't such a good idea. Some of these experiments took place at Stanford Research Institute, where volunteers thought they were participating in psychological studies and instead had their perception of reality systematically dismantled. Others at McGill University in Montreal, where a psychiatrist named Ewan Cameron developed something he called psychic driving, playing recorded messages to patients for weeks on end, sometimes while they were kept in drug-induced comas, until their personalities fragmented and reformed around whatever message was being drilled into their unconscious minds. The Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, dosed prisoners with LSD for 77 consecutive days. 77 days of chemically induced psychological breakdown, and the prisoners were offered reduced sentences or extra privileges for participating, as if there was any real consent involved when the alternative was more years behind bars. Boston Psychopathic Hospital participated, so did dozens of other institutions, prestigious universities and respected medical facilities, lending their names and facilities to experiments that would later be recognized as torture. They documented some of it, not all of it, not even most of it, and then, in 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the files destroyed. Helms claims he did it to protect operational security, to keep sensitive intelligence methods out of enemy hands. Critics say he did it to protect himself and everyone else who'd authorized or conducted these experiments, to destroy evidence before congressional investigators could start asking uncomfortable questions about what exactly the agency had been doing with taxpayer money and human subjects. Either way, thousands of pages went into the incinerator, documents describing experiments, results, methodologies, subject names, all of it reduced to ash and smoke. But not everything burned. Some files survived because they were misfiled, stuck in the wrong drawer or under the wrong classification code when the destruction order came down. Others survived because someone decided they were worth keeping, someone who understood that history had a way of catching up with secrets. And some, like Subproject 708, survived because they were never officially part of the program to begin with. The file ELE found. Subproject 708 was not listed in any declassified CIA document. It did not appear in the Church Committee hearings of 1975, when Congress finally forced the agency to admit what it had done, and the nation learned that their government had been conducting mind control experiments on its own citizens. It was not mentioned in the presidential apology that followed. It was not mentioned in any of the lawsuits filed by victims or their families. It was not mentioned in any of the historical retrospectives, the academic papers, the investigative journalism pieces that had been written about MKUltra in the decades since. According to the official record, Subproject 708 never existed, but Eli was holding proof that it did. The binder he opened that first afternoon in the storage unit contained case files for 12 subjects, coded by number and constellation name. Aries 1 through Pisces 12. Each file included behavioural charts, psychological evaluations, handwritten notes from observers, and photographs, mostly children, ranging in age from 6 to 14 years old. The photographs were what made him feel sick. Black and white, slightly grainy, clinical in composition. Children standing against height-marked walls like they were being booked for crimes. Children sitting in chairs, electrodes attached to their scalps, their faces blank and passive. Children in what looked like hospital beds, restraints visible at the edges of the frame. Their eyes were what got to him. Not frightened, not angry, just empty. The kind of emptiness that comes from having given up, from having learned that resistance is pointless, from having been broken down so thoroughly that compliance becomes the only available survival strategy. One girl, maybe 8 years old, identified as Libra 3. She had dark hair cut short, like someone had done it without much care for how it looked. In the photo, she stared directly at the camera with an expression that was somehow worse than sadness. It was absence, like whoever she'd been before was already gone. The dates range from 1961 to 1963. The locations rotated between 3 primary sites: Fort Detrick in Maryland, a facility in rural Vermont that was only identified by a site number, and a private residence in upstate New York listed simply as Site Amber. Fort Detrick was real. Eli knew that much. The Army's Biological Warfare Center during the Cold War, the place where anthrax and botulism and God knows what else were weaponized. It was also, according to declassified documents, one of the testing sites for certain MK-Ultra experiments, though the details remained classified. But nothing in the public record mentioned children, nothing mentioned Project Constellation, and nothing mentioned what Eli found next. Buried in the middle of the binder, a sub-file labelled Acquisition Protocol. The pages inside described in bureaucratic language that tried to make atrocity sound like policy, how the program obtained its subjects. They weren't volunteers, they weren't the adult prisoners or college students who'd participated in other MK-Ultra experiments. They were children removed from a government-run foster program in Massachusetts. The intake forms were meticulous. Name, age, date of birth, case number from the foster system, medical history, psychological evaluation, and then a section marked Suitability Assessment, where someone had made notes in cramped handwriting. Subject displays appropriate vulnerability markers, limited family connections, history of institutional care, unlikely to be missed. 3 children were documented in detail. The forms listed their names, though those names had been partially redacted in some kind of after-the-fact attempt at privacy protection that seemed almost obscene given what had been done to them. All 3 were described as psychologically vulnerable and suitable for extended observation. All 3 were later reported to authorities as runaways from the foster system. No investigations were conducted, no follow-up reports were filed. The caseworkers noted that runaways from foster care were common, that the children had been troubled and difficult to place, that their disappearance, while unfortunate, was not entirely unexpected. The case numbers in the foster system matched perfectly with 3 of the Constellation subject files: Aries 7, Libra 3, Capricorn 9. Someone had taken these children from a system that was supposed to protect them. Someone had erased their existence from official records. And someone had subjected them to experiments that the rest of MK-Ultra's victims, horrific as their experiences were, had never endured. Because the other MK-Ultra subjects eventually went home, eventually were released. Eventually, decades later, some of them learned what had been done to them and were able to speak about it, to seek compensation, to tell their stories. These children never got that chance. Eli sat on the cold concrete floor of that storage unit for 2 hours, reading through file after file, his journalist training trying to maintain objectivity, while another part of him wanted to burn every page so he wouldn't have to know that this had happened in his country, in his state, in his lifetime. But he didn't burn anything. He took photographs of every page. He loaded boxes into his car, making 3 trips up and down those concrete stairs while the afternoon faded into evening and the security lights in the parking lot flickered on. And then, in the last box he opened, he found the tapes. The recordings. The tapes were stored carefully, each reel to reel in its own cardboard case, stacked in a box with padding to protect them from damage. Someone had cared for these recordings, had wanted them to survive. The cases were labelled in that same careful typewriter font. Session L13, Adaptive Response Test, Constellation Initiation, Phase 3, Observation Only. There were 23 tapes in total. Eli hadn't owned a reel-to-reel player since college, back when he'd been a film studies major before switching to journalism, back when he'd spent late nights in editing bays, transferring old films and learning to love the texture of analogue media. But he knew someone who did. Marcus Webb ran a small audio restoration business out of his basement in Somerville, one of those side hustles that had somehow become a full-time career. He specialised in digitising old recordings for historical societies, documentary filmmakers, and amateur genealogists who wanted to preserve their grandparents' voices before the tapes degraded beyond recovery. Eli had done Marcus a favour 2 years back, a story about a crooked landlord who was trying to evict Marcus and 20 other tenants to convert their building into luxury condos. Eli's article had brought enough public attention that the landlord backed down and sold to a non-profit housing trust instead. Marcus answered on the second ring. Eli, it's been a minute. What's going on? I need a favour. I've got some old reel-to-reel tapes that need to be digitised. Can I bring them by tonight? Tonight? Man, I've got a date at 8. Cancel it. This is important. I'll owe you. A pause. Marcus knew Eli well enough to understand that important meant something serious. How important are we talking? Potentially career-defining. Potentially dangerous. Definitely something you'll want to be able to say you were, part of when this all comes out. Another pause, longer this time, then, come over, but you're buying me dinner while we work. Marcus's basement was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd turned nostalgia into a business model. Walls lined with vintage audio equipment, shelves full of carefully labelled tapes and records, a work table covered in wires and splicing equipment, and movie posters from the 70s covering every available wall space. Marcus himself was 35, rail thin, with a beard he'd been growing since graduate school, and a collection of band t-shirts that seemed to only include groups that had broken up before he was born. He cleared space on the work table while Eli unpacked the first tape. How old are these? Marcus asked, examining the case. 60 years, give or take. Marcus whistled low. These should have degraded by now. Magnetic tape doesn't last forever, especially not in random storage conditions. Someone took really good care of them. Can you tell anything else about them? Marcus held the case up to the light, squinting. Professional quality recording based on the tape brand. This isn't consumer-grade stuff. This is what you'd use in a radio studio or a research lab. And the storage method... He tapped the cardboard. This padding. The way they're organised. Someone knew what they were doing. Someone wanted these to last. He threaded the first tape onto his machine with practiced efficiency, adjusting tension and speed. The machine was a beautiful restored Revox, all chrome and switches, the kind of equipment that had cost a fortune in its day and was now kept alive by enthusiasts like Marcus, who understood that some technologies were worth preserving. Ready? Eli nodded. Marcus pressed play. Static. The hiss of empty tape running for a few seconds. Then a voice, male, calm and professional, speaking with the kind of measured authority that suggested medical training or military experience. Session L13, subject Aries 7, date October 12, 1962. Hypnotic induction, standard protocol. Subject has been prepared according to Phase 1 guidelines, proceeding with conditioning sequence. What followed was a hypnosis session. The voice guided the subject. Based on the breathing sounds, a child through a series of relaxation exercises. The tone was soothing, almost paternal, which made it somehow worse. You're feeling very relaxed now. Your arms are heavy. Your legs are heavy. You're safe here. You're comfortable. Nothing can hurt you when you listen to my voice. The breathing on the tape slowed, deepened. Good. Very good. Now we're going to talk about special words. These words are just for you. When you hear these words, they mean something special. Can you listen carefully? A small voice, barely audible. Yes. Good. The first word is constellation. When you hear the word constellation, you'll feel calm and safe, just like you feel right now. Say it with me. Constellation. Perfect. The second word is anchor. When you hear the word anchor, you'll stop what you're doing and wait for instructions. Say it. Anchor. Excellent. Now we're going to practice. I'm going to count backwards from 5, and when I reach 1, you'll wake up. But you won't remember this session. You won't remember my voice or these words. They'll be buried deep inside, waiting. When you hear them again, you'll know what to do without knowing why. Do you understand? I understand. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. A pause. Then the child's voice again, confused. Where am I? You're in the testing room. We were just talking about your drawings. Do you remember? Yes. The drawings. Good. Why don't you go rest now? We'll continue tomorrow. The tape ended. Eli and Marcus sat in silence for a long moment. What the fuck was that? Marcus finally said. Evidence of something that was never supposed to see the light of day. That was a kid. That voice was a kid. I know. Someone did that to a kid. Someone trained them like a dog, like a machine. I know. Marcus stood up, paced to the other side of the basement and back. We need to call someone, FBI, Justice Department, someone. Not yet. I need to hear the rest first. I need to understand what we're dealing with before we go public. The second tape was worse. This one was labelled Adaptive Response Test, dated February 1963. The recording quality was poorer, as if it had been made in a different location, or with different equipment. There was background noise, footsteps, a door closing, the hum of machinery. The same male voice from before. Subject 7, please state your designation. A young girl's voice, flat and emotionless. Aries 7. What is your number? 7. What is your constellation? Aries. Very good. We're going to do some exercises now. When you hear the tone, I want you to stand up and face the wall. Let's practice. A high-pitched tone, maybe 2 seconds long, shuffling sounds, footsteps. Good. Sit back down. More shuffling. Now we're going to try something new. When you hear 2 short tones, you'll count backwards from 20. Begin when you hear the signal. 2 short tones. The girl's voice still flat. 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Excellent. How do you feel? I feel nothing. A pause. Then a different voice, also male but older, speaking to someone off microphone. Response time is improving. Memory suppression is holding. She's ready. Phase 2 begins next week. We'll move her to Site Amber and start the memory integration trials. The first voice again. Subject 7, you may rest now. Remember, when you leave this room, you won't recall anything we discussed. You'll remember only that you had a nice conversation with the counsellor. I understand. The tape clicked off. Marcus had his head in his hands. Memory integration trials. What does that even mean? I don't know, but I think we're going to find out. They listened to 5 more tapes that night. Each one was worse than the last. Children being conditioned to respond to specific words, tones, even visual cues. Children describing dissociative states in clinical detail. Children who spoke in monotones about their own conditioning like they were observing it from outside their bodies. And through it all, that calm male voice, never angry, never impatient, treating the systematic destruction of young minds like it was just another job to be done well. It was after midnight when they reached the tape labelled with red ink, "Do not file, destroy after playback." The recording was short, less than 3 minutes. A single voice, male, whispering urgently like he was afraid of being overheard. If this ever gets out, it ends the agency, not just the program, the whole thing. Congress will tear us apart. Helms knows it. Dulles knew it. That's why we moved everything off the official logs. That's why 708 doesn't exist on paper. Static crackled. Then quieter. We're using techniques that go beyond anything authorised. The dissociation protocols, the long-term conditioning, the memory compartmentalisation. This isn't research anymore. We're creating something that's never existed before. And the subjects, Christ, the subjects are children. If the press gets wind of this, if the families figure it out, if even one of those kids remembers what we did, more static. Gottlieb wants to shut it down. He's worried we've gone too far, that we're creating something we can't control. But the results are undeniable. We've achieved sustained behavioural modification in 87% of subjects. Long-term memory suppression in 93%. If we can replicate this at scale, if we can refine the protocols... The tape cut off abruptly, like someone had physically stopped the recording. Eli checked the case. Someone had written a date in pencil on the spine. August 1963. That date was significant. In August of 1963, CIA Director John McCone had ordered that certain MKUltra files be moved off official logs and stored separately. It was part of a broader effort to compartmentalise the program, to create plausible deniability if anything ever came to light. Subproject 7. 08, it seemed, had been so sensitive that it was compartmentalised even within that compartmentalised system. We should stop, Marcus said. His face was pale and he'd stopped making eye contact with Eli halfway through the last tape. We should call someone now. There are 18 more tapes. I don't want to hear them. I know, but I need to. I need to understand the full scope before I write this story. This isn't a story, Eli. This is... I don't even know what this is. Evidence of crimes against humanity? A smoking gun? What are you supposed to do with something like this? Expose it. Make sure everyone knows what was done. Make sure it can never happen again. Marcus laughed, but there was no humour in it. You really think it's not still happening? You think this was unique? Programs like this don't just stop. Eli didn't have an answer for that. They called it a night at 2 a.m. Marcus made copies of everything they'd digitised so far, storing them on multiple hard drives with redundant backups. Years of working with historical preservation had made him paranoid about data loss. If anything happens to you, Marcus said as Eli was leaving, I'm going to the press with all of this. I'm going to every newspaper, every TV station, every website that will listen. Nothing's going to happen to me. Promise me anyway. I promise. Eli drove home through empty streets, the boxes of tapes and documents secured in his trunk. Boston at 2 a.m. was a different city. Quiet, almost peaceful. The kind of place where you could believe that terrible things weren't happening just beneath the surface of normal life. But he knew better now. He'd heard the tapes, he'd seen the photographs, and he was beginning to understand that some truths, once learned, couldn't be unlearned. The intersection. Over the next week, Eli barely slept. He dove deeper into the files, cross-referencing names and dates with everything he could find in the public record. His apartment became a command centre, walls covered with photocopies and printouts, timelines mapped out on poster boards, connections drawn with red string like something out of a conspiracy thriller. Except this wasn't fiction. This was real. He reached out to former CIA officers, the few who'd broken ranks over the years and were willing to talk about what they'd seen. He contacted historians who specialised in Cold War intelligence operations. He tracked down activists who'd spent decades fighting for MK-Ultra victims, trying to get them compensation and recognition for what had been done to them. One name kept coming up, Victor Marchetti. Marchetti was a former CIA officer who'd worked in the agency during the 60s and early 70s, rising to the position of executive assistant to the deputy director. In 1974, he'd broken ranks and published The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, one of the first books to expose agency operations to public scrutiny. The agency had tried to stop publication, marking more than 300 passages for deletion under national security laws. Marchetti fought them in court and won, though the published version still had deletion marks throughout, showing readers exactly what the government didn't want them to know. In the years since, he'd become something of an elder statesman in the intelligence whistleblower community, respected by some, reviled by others, always willing to talk about the things he'd seen that still bothered him decades later. Eli found him living in Virginia, outside Richmond, in a modest house with a garden that suggested retirement had been treating him well. He was 88 now, but his voice on the phone was strong and clear. An investigative journalist wants to talk about old CIA programs, Marchetti said when Eli called. Let me guess, you found something. Something that wasn't in the public releases. How did you know? Because I'm still alive. If you were just rehashing the official story, you wouldn't need to talk to me. The fact that you're calling means you've got something new, something they still care about keeping buried. They spoke on the phone for 2 hours that first time. Eli didn't reveal everything. He'd learned long ago to protect his sources and methods, but he sketched out enough for Marchetti to understand what he was dealing with. Subproject 708, Marchetti repeated when Eli mentioned the number. Never heard it. But that doesn't mean it didn't exist. There were programs within programs, operations that only a handful of people knew about. If you're telling me they were running conditioning experiments on children, I believe you. I saw enough to know that nothing was off the table. Did you ever hear about something called Project Constellation? Eli asked. A long pause. In the background, Eli could hear birds singing. A peaceful retirement afternoon in Virginia, except they were discussing child abuse and psychological torture. No, Marchetti finally said, but there were rumours. This would have been late 60s, maybe early 70s. I heard whispers about a long-term program, something that involved subjects who were monitored for years after the initial conditioning. The idea was to see if the effects persisted, if they could be reactivated later. I never saw documentation. No one who talked about it would admit to knowing details, but people talked. Who ran it? Had to be Gottlieb's people. He was the only one with the authority and the institutional protection to pull something like that off. Dulles protected him. Helms protected him. Even McCone, who supposedly cleaned house when he took over, let Gottlieb keep running his experiments. Why? Because it worked. Because whatever objections anyone had about ethics or legality, the results were compelling enough that people looked the other way. That's how these things always go. The ends justify the means until suddenly they don't, and by then it's too late. After the call ended, Eli sat in his apartment and stared at the files spread across his floor. He thought about the children in those photographs, thought about what had happened to them after the program supposedly ended, thought about whether anyone had ever checked to see if they were okay, if they'd survived, if they'd been able to build anything resembling normal lives. He went back to the files and started looking for outcomes. Most of the Constellation subject files ended in 1963 or 1964, with final notations like subject transferred or observation concluded. No details about where they were transferred to or what observation concluded actually meant. But one file was different. Ares 7. The file for Ares 7 continued beyond 1964. There were periodic check-ins, psychological evaluations conducted under false pretenses, incident reports that suggested someone had been monitoring the subject into adulthood. The check-ins happened every few years. 1968, 1972, 1981, 1989. Each one documenting the subject's location, employment status, relationships, mental health. Like the program had never really ended. It had just gone dormant, watching and waiting. The last entry was dated April 1997. It described a violent episode in a small town in New Hampshire. Ares 7, now an adult living under their original name, had experienced what local newspapers described as a psychotic break. The incident involved a confrontation at a grocery store, erratic behaviour, claims of hearing voices giving specific instructions. Police were called. The subject was hospitalised for 3 days, then released. The official diagnosis was brief psychotic disorder, stress-induced. Medication was prescribed, follow-up care was recommended, and that would have been the end of it. Just another sad case of mental illness in small-town America, except for what Eli found attached to the hospital report. A handwritten note on CIA letterhead, dated 1 week after the incident. Trigger phrase confirmed effective after 34 years. Subject responded to auditory cue exactly as predicted. Memory suppression protocols remain intact. Subject has no conscious recall of program participation. Recommend continued observation. Long-term viability of conditioning confirmed. Eli read it 3 times, his hand shaking. He had reactivated the conditioning. More than 3 decades after the program supposedly ended, someone had tracked down Ares 7, now a middle-aged adult trying to live a normal life, and had deliberately triggered the psychological programming that had been implanted when they were a child, just to see if it still worked. It did. And someone had documented the results like it was a successful experiment, rather than evidence of ongoing psychological torture. Eli stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the Boston street below. Normal people living normal lives, going to work, getting coffee, complaining about the weather, having no idea what their government had done was perhaps still doing to its own citizens. He thought about going public immediately, calling every journalist he knew, uploading the documents to every whistleblower site he could find, making sure this couldn't be buried again. But his training told him to wait, to build the case properly, to understand the full scope before making any moves. He went back to the files and kept digging. The knock on the door, 3 days after Eli started organising the files into a coherent narrative for publication, someone knocked on his door. It was 4 p.m, one of those late November days when dusk comes early and the light takes on a bruised quality, yellow and grey at the same time. Eli had been working for 10 straight hours, surviving on coffee and crackers, lost in the details of case files and cross-reference timelines. The knock was firm, official. The kind of knock that comes from someone who expects the door to be opened. Eli looked through the peephole. 2 men in dark suits stood on his stoop, hands clasped in front of them, expressions neutral. They had that particular quality that screamed federal employee. Too well-groomed, too bland, too deliberately unremarkable. He opened the door but left the chain on. "Can I help you?" The taller of the 2 men smiled. It was the kind of smile you practice in a mirror, calculated to seem friendly while conveying no actual warmth. "Mr. Mercer, we're with a federal contracting firm that handles record preservation for various government agencies. We understand you may have come into possession of some historical materials that technically belong to the government." "I'm a journalist. I come into possession of a lot of materials. These would be specific documents related to Cold War-era programs, CIA materials, classified materials that were never properly declassified despite their age." "I don't know what you're talking about." The man's smile didn't waver. "We're not here to cause problems, Mr. Mercer. We're authorised to retrieve these materials and ensure they're properly archived. There's no punishment involved, no charges. We just need the documents back." "Archived?" Eli repeated. "You mean destroyed?" "We prefer the term secured. These documents contain sensitive information, even after all these years. Unauthorised access to them could pose national security concerns." National security? Right. Because God forbid people learn what their government did to children in the name of fighting communists. The second man spoke for the first time, his voice flat and bureaucratic. "Mr. Mercer, we're trying to handle this quietly, but if necessary, we can obtain a warrant and make this much more complicated for everyone involved. We're asking nicely. Turn over the materials and this goes away. You can go back to your work. We can go back to ours. No one needs to know this conversation happened." "And if I don't?" The taller man's smile finally faded. "Then we stop asking nicely. Then we start looking into tax returns and financial records and professional licensing. We start talking to your editors and your sources. We make your life very difficult in ways that are perfectly legal and impossible to fight. That's a threat. That's a reality. You're holding materials that you weren't authorised to possess. We're offering you a way out. I'd suggest you take it. Get off my property." The 2 men looked at each other. Some unspoken communication passed between them. Then they both nodded to Eli and walked down the steps without another word. Eli closed the door and locked it, his heart pounding. He went to his window and watched them get into a black sedan parked across the street. They sat there for 10 minutes, just waiting, making sure he saw them. Then they drove away. He immediately called Marcus. "I need you to make copies of everything we digitised. Tonight, multiple copies, different locations." "What happened?" "They came to my apartment. Federal contractors, they said. Wanted the materials back." "Shit! Eli, maybe you should..." "I'm not giving them back. But I need the documents secured. Can you do it?" A pause. Then, "Yeah. Bring everything over. I'll make copies, and we'll figure out a distribution plan." Eli started gathering the files, his hands working on autopilot while his brain tried to process what was happening. They'd found him within a week, which meant either the storage facility had alerted someone, or his phone calls to former CIA officers had triggered some kind of monitoring system, or the whole thing had been a setup from the beginning. What if someone wanted these files to be found? What if the package, the key, the signature, what if all of it was deliberate? But why? What purpose would it serve to leak evidence of crimes and then try to take it back? He didn't have answers. He just knew he needed to move fast. The storage facility called his cell phone as he was loading boxes into his car. "Mr. Mercer, this is Janet from Cambridge Self-Storage. I need to inform you that some men were here this morning with a federal warrant. They cleared out Unit 39. His heart sank. "What did they take?" "Everything. The whole unit. They brought a truck. Took them about 2 hours to load it all up. They were very thorough." "Did they leave anything?" "Let me check the log." Papers rustling. "Yeah, actually. They left one item. A card. The manager said it seemed deliberate. like they wanted you to know they'd been there. "I'll be right there." He drove to Cambridge in a daze, the implications settling over him like a weight. They had the original documents now. Everything he had were copies, photographs, digital files, still valuable, still publishable. But without the originals, proving authenticity would be harder. The unit was empty when he got there, just bare concrete walls and floor. In the centre of the space, sitting exactly where he'd found the first folder, was the index card. The same card, the same yellowed paper, the same signature, Sidney Gottlieb. But this time, there was something written on the back, in fresh ink, black and sharp. "You were always part of this." Eli stood in that empty storage unit for a long time, holding the card, trying to understand what it meant. The hidden tape. That night, Eli tore his apartment apart. He went through every box he'd brought back from the storage unit, every file he'd photographed, every note he'd taken. He was looking for anything he might have missed, any piece of evidence the contractors might not have found, anything that would help him make sense of what was happening. At 3 a.m, exhausted and running on pure adrenaline, he found it. The binder that had contained the Subproject 708 files was sitting on his couch, where he'd left it after photographing the contents. He picked it up to put it away and felt something shift inside the spine. He'd assumed the binder was empty now, all its contents photographed and catalogued. But the spine felt heavier than it should. He examined it closely. The interior lining was foam padding, common in archival binders to protect documents. But one section felt different. He pressed on it and felt something hard underneath. Using a knife, he carefully cut away the foam lining. Inside was a small cassette tape, the kind used in handheld recorders in the 80s and 90s. It had been pressed flat into a carved-out space in the foam, hidden so well that he'd handled the binder dozens of times without noticing. Its label read simply, "End Condition, Audio Only." His hands were shaking as he found an old cassette player in the back of his closet. He pressed play. Static. Then a voice. Male. Calm and measured. Not the voice from the other tapes. Someone older. "If you're hearing this, the program still works. You were selected because of your ability to uncover information, to pursue leads, to ask questions that others wouldn't ask. These are useful traits. These are traits we cultivated." Eli's breath caught in his throat. The voice continued. "Your involvement was not accidental. Your discovery of these files was not coincidental. We've been watching you for a very long time, Eli. Since you were a child. Since before you became a journalist. Since before you knew what questions to ask." A second voice now. Female. Older. With an accent he couldn't place, but that somehow felt familiar. Like something from a dream he couldn't quite remember. "Eli, your father was part of Subproject 708. He was not a subject. He was an administrator. He worked at Site Amber from 1961 to 1964, managing intake and behavioural assessments. He was good at his job, very good. He understood what we were trying to accomplish." Eli's vision went blurry. He sat down hard on his couch. The female voice went on, relentless. "When the program was shut down, or rather, when it was officially shut down, your father was relocated, given a new identity, a new life. He was told the program had ended, that his work was classified but complete. He spent the rest of his life believing that. He died believing he'd left it all behind," the male voice returned. "But programs like this never truly end, Eli. They evolve, they adapt, and sometimes they select new participants from the children of those who came before. You were always going to find this. The question was never if, only when, only whether you'd been properly prepared." The tape clicked off. Eli sat frozen, the cassette player still running, producing nothing but empty static. His father, who had died when Eli was 15. His father, who had always been quiet about his work, always deflecting questions about his past. His father, who had encouraged Eli to ask questions, to seek truth, to never accept the official story. His father, who had worked at a place called Site Amber, doing God knows what to children. Eli's stomach churned. He stood up, walked to the bathroom and vomited. When he came back, he made himself listen to the tape again, and again, trying to find some flaw, some indication that it was a fabrication, a psychological operation designed to break him. But he couldn't. The voices sounded genuine, the details were too specific, and worse, the female voice was familiar in a way that suggested he'd heard it before, long ago in circumstances he couldn't quite remember. He thought about his childhood, tried to remember if there had been anything unusual, any gaps in his memory, any experiences that seemed strange looking back. And he found them. Small things. A hospital stay when he was 7 that his mother had always described as a routine testing, but that he couldn't quite remember. Dreams he'd had as a child, vivid and recurring, about rooms with white walls and voices asking him questions. A fear of certain sounds, high-pitched tones, specific combinations of notes that he'd never been able to explain. He'd always assumed these were just quirks of memory, the kind of strange half-recollections everyone has from childhood. But what if they weren't? The medical record. Dawn was breaking when Eli finally moved from the couch. His body felt heavy, like he was moving through water. He made coffee but couldn't drink it. Stood at his window watching the city wake up, watching normal people start their normal days. Then he remembered. His father's belongings. The boxes that had been sitting in his closet for 20 years, untouched since his mother had sent them after his father's funeral. Eli had been in college then, too overwhelmed with grief to go through them. Later, after graduation, after his career took off, he'd kept meaning to sort through them, but never quite found the time. Or maybe, some part of him had known not to look too closely. The boxes were in the back of his bedroom closet, covered with dust. 3 cardboard boxes labelled Dad's Things in his mother's handwriting. He opened them methodically, forcing himself to be thorough. Clothes that still smelled faintly of his father's cologne, books about history and government, a watch that had stopped working years ago, photo albums from before Eli was born. In the second box he found a manila envelope marked medical records, confidential. His hands were shaking as he opened it. Inside was a file from Boston Children's Hospital, dated 1992. Eli would have been 7 years old. The file was thick, maybe 30 pages of forms and evaluations and test results. The cover sheet described it as a comprehensive psychological and developmental assessment, requested by Eli's primary care physician, due to concerns about attention and behavioural regulation. Eli didn't remember having any such concerns. He'd been a normal kid, maybe a little shy, but normal. He read through the forms, standard questions about behaviour, sleep patterns, social interaction. Then more specialised tests, memory assessments, response to stimuli, questions about imagination and suggestibility. The evaluating physician was listed as a specialist in child development. The name meant nothing to Eli, but the signature on the final page made his skin crawl. It was precise, careful, the same handwriting he'd seen on notes throughout the Constellation subject files. At the bottom of the final page, stamped in faded blue ink, was a symbol he recognised immediately. A circle with 12 points. The Constellation symbol. Below it, a designation. Candidate 13. And below that, a note in handwriting he now recognised as his father's. Subject displays high susceptibility to guided narrative construction and information-seeking behaviour. Pattern recognition skills above age-appropriate levels. Recommend continued passive observation. Further assessment at ages 14 and 21. Activation protocols to be determined pending behavioural development. Eli read it 5 times. 10 times. His father had written this. His father had evaluated him like he was a test subject. His father had recommended continued observation. Continued observation meant someone had been watching him for years, maybe his entire life. He thought about every major decision he'd made, his choice to become a journalist, his focus on investigative work, his obsession with uncovering hidden truths about government programs, the instinct that drove him to pursue stories even when they became dangerous, even when everyone told him to let them go. Had any of it been his choice, or had he been conditioned from childhood to follow this exact path, to develop these exact skills, to serve some purpose he still didn't fully understand? He looked at the medical file again, flipped through the pages one more time looking for anything he'd missed, and there, tucked into the back of the file, he found a photograph. It showed him at 7 years old, sitting in what looked like a hospital room. He was drawing something, crayons spread out on a table in front of him. Behind him, partially visible in the background, was a woman in a white coat. Her face was turned away from the camera, but something about her posture, the way she stood, was familiar. He looked closer. On the wall behind her, barely visible, was a poster. The image was too small to make out clearly, but the shape was unmistakable. A constellation, 12 points arranged in a circle, the same symbol from the files, the same symbol stamped on his medical records. Eli sat on his bedroom floor, surrounded by his father's belongings, and tried to piece together a truth that was almost too vast to comprehend. The key had been sent to him deliberately. The storage unit had been maintained for decades, waiting. The signature had been left as a message, not from Sidney Gottlieb, but from whoever had continued his work. They had wanted him to find the files. They had wanted him to uncover Subproject 708. They had wanted him to learn about the children, the conditioning, the long-term monitoring, because he was one of them, not a subject exactly. Something else, something new, a second generation. The child of an administrator who had been enrolled in the program himself, evaluated and observed and shaped from childhood to become exactly what he'd become. An investigative journalist obsessed with uncovering government secrets. Someone who would inevitably find these files and pursue the truth no matter the cost. Someone whose entire life might be an experiment in whether the conditioning could be passed down, whether the traits could be cultivated without the brutal methods used on the original subjects. The final realization. Eli spent the next 2 days barely moving from his apartment. He didn't eat. He slept in fitful bursts, waking up every few hours with the feeling that someone was watching him. He reviewed everything again. Every file, every tape, every note, looking for confirmation or refutation of what he'd learned. The evidence was compelling but not definitive. The medical file could be legitimate concern about a child's development. The photograph could be coincidence. His father's note could be... No, he couldn't lie to himself anymore. He thought about every major decision he'd made in his life. Tried to trace the origins of his interests, his obsessions, his compulsions. When had he first become interested in government secrets? Had it been after reading a book in high school, or had someone suggested that book? Had it been after seeing a documentary, or had someone made sure he saw that documentary? When had he decided to become a journalist? Had it been his own choice, or had his high school guidance counsellor steered him toward it? And who had recommended that counsellor? How many of his choices had actually been his own? The worst part was the uncertainty. He could never know for sure. Even if he spent the rest of his life analysing every decision, every influence, he could never be certain which thoughts were his and which had been planted. That uncertainty was worse than any definitive answer could be. He looked at his phone, at the contacts list of sources and editors, at the draft of the article he'd been preparing about Subproject 708. He could still publish it. He should publish it. The world deserved to know what had been done, what might still be being done. But what if publishing it was exactly what they wanted? What if his entire life had been preparation for this moment? What if the whole point of the experiment was to see if he would uncover the truth and expose it, proving that the conditioning worked not just on individuals but across generations? He thought about the index card left in the empty storage unit. You were always part of this. And he realised with a clarity that felt like ice water in his veins. Whoever sent him the key knew everything. They knew his history. They knew his father's history. They knew about the childhood evaluations, the passive observation, the decades of monitoring. They had been watching him for 37 years, waiting to see if the conditioning would hold. waiting to see if he would do exactly what he'd done. Find the files, read the documents, listen to the tapes, discover the truth about Subproject 708 and about himself. And in discovering it, prove that the program worked. Prove that you could shape a human life from childhood, cultivate specific traits and obsessions, guide someone down a predetermined path without them ever knowing they weren't making their own choices. The decision. Eli Jones sat in his apartment as November faded into December, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that had never truly ended, and realised he might never know which thoughts were his own, and which had been planted there decades ago by men in white coats who believed the mind was just another machine to be programmed. The worst part wasn't the uncertainty. The worst part was that, even knowing all of this, even understanding that he might be a puppet dancing on strings he couldn't see, he was still going to publish the story. Because that's what they had made him to do. Or maybe it was what he'd chosen to do, and they'd just known him well enough to predict it. Or maybe there was no difference anymore. He looked at the draft article on his laptop. 10,000 words documenting Subproject 708, the Constellation Children, the decades of monitoring, all of it backed up by photographs of documents and digital copies of tapes. Enough to cause a scandal, enough to trigger investigations, enough to force the government to admit to crimes that went beyond even the acknowledged horrors of MKUltra. He thought about the men who had come to his door, the warning they'd given, the threat to make his life difficult. They could have silenced him. They could have made him disappear. But they hadn't. Because maybe they didn't need to. Maybe they already knew how this would end. His phone rang. Marcus. Have you made a decision? I'm publishing it. Even knowing, especially knowing, if I don't publish because I'm afraid I'm being manipulated, then they've won anyway. At least this way the truth gets out. At least people will know what was done. And if you're doing exactly what they want, then maybe what they want and what should happen are the same thing. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the whole experiment was to see if they could create someone who would expose the truth, even if it destroyed them. A long pause, then, when? Tomorrow. I'll send it to every outlet that might publish it. Major papers, independent journalists, whistleblower sites, all at once. Make it impossible to suppress. Be careful, Eli. It's too late for careful. He hung up and went back to the article. Read through it one more time, making sure every claim was supported, every source was documented, every detail was as accurate as he could make it. Then he looked at the index card one final time. The signature, the message on the back. You were always part of this. And he realised something that made him laugh, though there was no humour in it. They were right. He had always been part of this. But that didn't mean he had to be what they wanted him to be. Maybe they'd shaped him to uncover secrets. Maybe they'd cultivated his obsessive pursuit of truth. Maybe they'd even known he would eventually discover his own connection to the program. But they couldn't control what he did with that knowledge. They couldn't control whether he chose to see himself as a victim, or as someone who could use their own methods against them. They couldn't control the story he would tell. Eli opened his laptop and added one final section to the article. A personal note at the end describing his own possible connection to the program. His father's role, the medical records, the childhood photographs, the possibility that he himself was a subject or candidate, or whatever term they'd used. He included the photograph from his medical file, his 7-year-old self drawing with crayons, unaware that he was being evaluated like a laboratory animal. He wrote, I may never know if my interest in this story was truly my own, or if I was conditioned from childhood to pursue exactly this type of investigation. I may never know if my entire career has been an extension of an experiment that began before I was born. But I do know this. The children in these files deserved better. They deserve protection, not exploitation. They deserve childhoods, not conditioning. And they deserve to have their stories told, even if telling them serves someone else's purpose. Even if I'm exactly what they made me to be, I can still choose to use that to expose what they did. That choice, at least, is mine. He saved the document, queued up the emails to a dozen different outlets, attached all the supporting documentation. His finger hovered over the send button. In some office he would never find, someone was probably watching, waiting to see what happened next. The program, after all, was still running. It had never stopped, and Eli Jones was just the latest subject to prove it worked. But he was also the one who was going to make sure the world knew. He pressed send. Epilogue. The story broke 3 days later. The Washington Post published it first, followed within hours by the New York Times, The Guardian, and a dozen other outlets. Within a week, it was the lead story on every major news network. Congressional committees announced investigations. The CIA issued a statement neither confirming nor denying, which everyone understood as confirmation. Eli gave interviews, appeared on television, answered questions from investigators, and every night he went home to his apartment and wondered if this was what they'd wanted all along. The attention, the scandal, the investigations that would ultimately go nowhere because too many people were dead, and too many records were destroyed, and too much time had passed. Maybe the whole point was to create a release valve. Let some truth out in a controlled way. Make people angry enough to feel like something had been exposed, but not angry enough to actually change anything. Or maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe sometimes a whistleblower was just a whistleblower, and not every revelation was part of some deeper game. He wanted to believe that. He tried to believe that. But late at night, when he couldn't sleep, he would think about the card left in the empty storage unit. You were always part of this. And he would wonder if he'd ever truly had a choice at all. Somewhere, in an office he would never find, someone was probably still watching, still taking notes, still documenting the results of an experiment that had been running for 40 years. The program worked. It had always worked. And Eli Jones had just proven it one more time. Make sure to leave your video ideas in the comments below. The encrypted file arrived at 3:47 AM on a Tuesday that would later be erased from official records. Rebecca Martinez didn't hear the notification. She was already awake, staring at the ceiling of her Brussels apartment, unable to shake the feeling that someone had been watching her building for the past 3 nights. The paranoia was new, the insomnia wasn't. When you spent 15 years documenting suppressed historical records for the International Archives Initiative, sleep became a luxury reserved for people who didn't know what they knew. Her phone buzzed again, then again. She rolled over, squinting at the screen. 23 messages, all from the same encrypted number, all sent within the last 90 seconds. The final message was simple. Open the packet, then run. Victor. Rebecca's hands trembled as she sat up. Victor Molnar, Hungarian intelligence defector. She'd met him exactly once 6 months ago at a cafe in Vienna, where he'd passed her a napkin with a single word written in barely visible pencil. Seraphim. She'd researched the term obsessively after that meeting, found nothing conclusive. Historical references to angels, to divine beings, to mythological guardians. Nothing that explained why a career intelligence officer would risk his life to whisper it to her. Now he was telling her to run. Rebecca pulled on jeans and a sweater, her heart hammering. The packet sat on her kitchen counter, where the courier had left it the previous evening. Plain manila envelope, no return address. She'd been too exhausted to open it, planning to examine it properly in the morning with coffee and her recording equipment. She didn't have that luxury anymore. Inside the envelope was a USB drive and a single sheet of aged paper, protected by archival plastic. The document appeared to be a photocopy of a diplomatic memorandum, dated 1952, bearing the seal of the Belgian royal household. Most of it was in French, but one phrase had been highlighted in yellow, the ink faded but still legible. Préserver la lignée des Séraphins à tout prix. Preserve the Seraphim bloodline at all costs. Beneath it, in Victor's handwriting, it was never about religion, it was about species. Rebecca heard footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment. Slow, deliberate, stopping directly in front of her door. She grabbed her laptop bag, shoved the USB drive into her pocket and went out the window. The train to Amsterdam gave Rebecca 4 hours to examine the contents of Victor's USB drive, without worrying about being cornered in a confined space. She'd chosen a middle car, positioned herself where she could watch both entrances, and created 3 separate cloud backups before the train even left Brussels. The drive contained 47 files, medical records, genetic sequencing reports, internal memos from private genetics companies spanning 2 decades, and one 70-page white paper that made her hands shake so badly she had to set down her coffee. The title page read, S-Helix Variant Analysis, Preliminary Findings and Containment Protocol, authored by Helix Genomics SA, Zurich. Date, September 2019. Classification, internal review only. Rebecca began reading. The document described a genetic anomaly first identified in 2003 during routine ancestry testing conducted by a California-based consumer genetics company. A wealthy client, name redacted, had submitted their DNA for analysis and received results that triggered automatic flagging within the company's quality control systems. The anomaly wasn't a mutation. It was a structural variant in what geneticists typically classified as junk DNA, the 98% of the human genome that doesn't code for proteins. Except this particular sequence wasn't junk. It was organised, intentional, and it appeared in exactly the same location across multiple unrelated individuals who submitted samples over the following months. By 2008, private genetics companies had identified the variant in 14 distinct family lineages, some European aristocracy, some Middle Eastern royal families, a handful embedded in American banking dynasties and political families. The pattern was impossible to ignore. They called it the S-Helix variant. Publicly, it was dismissed as a benign evolutionary remnant, a footnote in genetic diversity studies. But the internal communications told a different story. Rebecca scrolled through email chains between geneticists who'd stumbled onto the variant. The earliest exchanges were cautious, professional, scientists sharing anomalous data, requesting peer review. But as months turned into years, the tone shifted. Confusion gave way to concern. Concern gave way to something that looked a lot like fear. One email from 2006, sent by a lead researcher at the California company to her supervisor. I've been running the S-Helix sequence through every comparative analysis tool we have. It doesn't match any known primate DNA. I expanded the search to all mammalian genomes in our database. Nothing. I even ran it against our limited reptilian and avian samples. The structure is completely novel. But here's what's keeping me up at night. It's not random. Random junk DNA has statistical markers we can identify. This sequence has intentional structure. It's like finding a paragraph of Shakespeare in the middle of random letter sequences. Someone wrote this, something wrote this, and it's sitting in the genome of some of the most powerful families in the world. The supervisor's response had been brief. Delete this email. We'll discuss in person. But the emails continued, routed through personal accounts, encrypted services, back channels. Rebecca found a thread from 2009 where 3 geneticists from different companies, competitors technically, were sharing data in secret. I've confirmed the variant in 7 of my flagged samples, one wrote, all from families with documented lineages going back at least 5 centuries. Old money, old power. This isn't random distribution. Same here, another replied. But here's what I can't explain. Why is it only expressing in some family members? I've got siblings where one carries active S helix and the other shows no trace. It's not following Mendelian inheritance patterns. The third geneticist's response was the most unsettling. Because it's not being inherited, it's being activated. I think we're looking at dormant code that switches on under specific conditions, like a program waiting for the right input. Rebecca sat back, watching Belgian countryside blur into Dutch flatlands through the train window. Dormant code, waiting for input. She kept reading. One memo, dated March 2011, from the Chief Science Officer of Helix Genomics to an unnamed recipient. We've run the S-helix through every comparative database available. Primate, mammalian, vertebrate. The sequence doesn't match anything in the known biological record. More concerning, when exposed to specific electromagnetic frequencies in laboratory conditions, the variant exhibits responsive behaviour. It's not just sitting there, it's listening. Rebecca read the sentence 3 times. It's listening. The memo continued with technical details that made her head spin, frequency ranges, resonance patterns. But the conclusion was clear. When synthetic S-helix sequences were exposed to electromagnetic radiation in specific frequency bands, particularly those used in cellular communications and Wi-Fi networks, the DNA structure changed configuration. Not degraded, changed, unfolded, like it was receiving a signal. Another memo from 2015 referenced a consultation with a retired geneticist named Emil Voss, formerly of the Max Planck Institute. His assessment had been suppressed within hours of submission. The S-helix is not random genetic drift. It's architecture. Whoever designed it understood genetics at a level we're only beginning to approach. This isn't human DNA contamination. This isn't viral integration. This is something else. Something not entirely human, but not random. I've spent 40 years studying genetic mutations and evolutionary biology. Nothing in my experience prepared me for this. The S-helix isn't evolving toward anything. It's already complete. It's been complete for thousands of years, just waiting. The question isn't what it is. The question is what happens when it fully activates. The white paper included appendices with case studies. Rebecca read through them with growing unease. Case study A7. Female, age 34, investment banker, New York. Submitted DNA for ancestry testing in 2014. S-helix variant confirmed. Follow-up interview, conducted under guise of routine customer service, revealed subject had recently begun experiencing unusual clarity in pattern recognition. Subject reported ability to see market trends before they manifested in data. Subject attributed this to years of experience. Genetic counselling recommended. Subject declined further contact. Case study. B12. Male, age 41. Mid-level diplomat, Brussels. S-helix variant confirmed during routine security clearance medical screening. Subject demonstrated abnormal stress response during psychological evaluation. Decreased cortisol under pressure. Enhanced cognitive function during crisis simulation. When asked about this, subject stated, "I've always been good in emergencies. It's like everything slows down and becomes clear." Subject showed no awareness of physiological abnormality. Case study C3. Female, age 28, software engineer, Silicon Valley. S-helix variant confirmed. Subject sought genetic testing after experiencing what she described as feeling like I'm interfacing with code instead of reading it. Neurological evaluation showed unusual synchronization between visual cortex and pattern recognition centers. Subject was developing AI algorithms with efficiency that puzzled her supervisors. "It's not that I'm smarter," subject reported. "It's that I can see how the systems want to organize themselves." Case after case. People living normal lives, excelling in their fields, unaware that their DNA contained something impossible. The white paper concluded with a recommendation that made Rebecca's stomach turn. Given the potential implications for global security and social stability, we recommend indefinite classification of S-helix findings under existing national security protocols. Public disclosure could trigger widespread panic and destabilization of affected family structures, many of whom occupy positions of significant political and economic influence. Furthermore, preliminary psychological assessment suggests that informing S-helix carriers of their genetic status may trigger latent activation events. Recommend strict information containment and monitoring protocols. Translation: don't tell anyone, don't ask questions, pretend it doesn't exist, and whatever you do, don't tell the people who carry it. Rebecca leaned back in her seat, processing what she'd read. 14 bloodlines, positions of influence, a genetic marker that responded to electromagnetic signals. People who were getting better at their jobs, better at seeing patterns, at handling stress, at interfacing with complex systems without understanding why. She pulled up her research notes on Victor's original message. Seraphim. She'd found references in ancient texts, beings described as divine messengers, often depicted with multiple wings and eyes of fire. But she dismissed it as metaphor, religious symbolism. What if it wasn't? What if the ancient texts were describing real beings? Not supernatural entities, but a different species, or a hybrid species, that had walked the earth and interbred with humans. What if their descendants were still here? Her phone buzzed. Unknown. Number. The message was brief. Victor is dead. You have what he died for. Use it. They're already watching you. Rebecca looked up sharply, scanning the train car. Business travellers, students, an elderly couple sharing a thermos of coffee. No one paying attention to her, but the message felt like ice water in her veins. The train suddenly felt very small. She went back to the files, pulling up a document she'd initially skipped over because it seemed like a bureaucratic personnel memo. Now she read it carefully. It was from Helix Genomics, dated 2018. A termination letter for one of the geneticists who'd been sharing information in those encrypted email chains. Effective immediately, your employment with Helix Genomics SA is terminated. Severance package and confidentiality agreement enclosed. Failure to comply with NDA terms will result in immediate legal action and potential criminal prosecution under Swiss national security statutes. All research materials, including personal notes and communications, are property of Helix Genomics and must be surrendered. Rebecca cross-referenced the name. Thomas Brenner, the geneticist who'd written, "It's like finding a paragraph of Shakespeare in random letter sequences." She searched for his name online, found an obituary from 2019, heart attack at age 43, no prior history of cardiac issues. She searched for the other two geneticists from that email thread. One had died in a car accident in 2017. Single vehicle collision, no witnesses. The other had simply disappeared in 2020, left for a conference in Singapore, never arrived, never seen again. 3 scientists who'd shared information about the S-helix variant, all dead or missing within 4 years. Rebecca looked at Victor's message again. Then run. She was beginning to understand why. Rebecca spent 3 days in Amsterdam, moving between internet cafes and using burner devices to research without leaving a digital trail. She needed to understand the historical context. If the seraphim were real, if they'd existed in some form throughout human history, there would be evidence, fragments, patterns. She started with Mesopotamia, in the cradle of civilization where writing itself was born. The earliest references appeared in pre-Sumerian archaeological fragments recovered from sites in modern-day Iraq and Syria. Most were heavily damaged, but one partially intact tablet from approximately 4000 BCE contained a passage that had puzzled archaeologists for decades. Rebecca found it in a digitised archive from the British Museum, catalogued but not widely published. The translation had been completed in 1952 by a scholar who'd later withdrawn from academic life entirely. His notes, attached to the file, were illuminating. This text does not fit established Sumerian mythology. It predates the pantheon we associate with later Mesopotamian culture. The language is Proto-Sumerian, possibly older. What disturbs me most is the specificity. This is not myth, This reads like a historical account. The tablet itself, what remained of it. In the time before the great cities, the seraphim ruled from the mountain places. They were flesh-born, not spirit-born, and their skin gleamed like beaten gold when seen in the light of the horizon sun. They taught the people to mark the stars and to divide the year. They showed the way of numbers and the growing of grain. They took mates from among the people, but only those of certain blood. Their children were mighty, and their children's children built the first walls. The seraphim knew what was coming. They prepared chambers beneath the mountains. They said, "We go down into the deep earth, but our blood remains in you." When the sky speaks with lightning that is not lightning, when your children build towers that think, then our children's children will remember what they are. Their rule was law, until the fire came from the sky and the earth shook. The seraphim went beneath. Some of the people went with them, most stayed above. The seraphim said, "We do not die, we wait. Keep the blood pure. When we wake, you will wake." Rebecca read it 3 times, each reading making her hand shake more. When your children build towers that think. That was written 4,000 years before computers existed. She found corroborating references in fragments from other ancient cultures, each adding pieces to the same impossible story. The Nag Hammadi Library, a collection of early Christian and Gnostic texts discovered in Egypt in 1945, contained multiple references to beings called Watchers, or Seraphim, who descended to Earth and took human wives, producing offspring. But the Gnostic texts added details that mainstream religious scholarship often glossed over. Rebecca found a passage in the secret book of John that had been partially censored in most published translations. The Watchers were not of heaven, though they came from above the mountains. They were not spirit, though they lived longer than the generations of men. They were flesh, but flesh unlike ours. They saw what humanity would become and planted themselves in our lineage, so that when the time of great change arrived, some among us would be prepared for transformation. They did not come to judge or to save. They came to ensure the seed would survive what was coming. They mixed their essence with clay, and from this came those who could walk between worlds. These children appeared human, but carried within them the potential for something more. Egyptian records told similar stories, but with different emphasis. Rebecca found references in a doctoral thesis about the priest dynasties along the Nile that had never been widely distributed. The scholar had translated hieroglyphics from a tomb in Saqqara, dated to the early dynastic period around 3000 BCE. The Neteru came from the place where the 2 rivers meet the mountains. They were not gods, but the children of gods, and they taught the kingmakers how to preserve the divine blood through the generations. The Neteru could see in darkness. Their eyes reflected copper in lamplight. Their skin in certain seasons showed patterns like serpent scales beneath. They took only those of pure lineage as consorts. When the great death came from the sky, the Neteru went into the hidden places. They said, "Your children will not remember us as we are. They will make us into stories and paintings. This is as it should be, but some will carry our seed forward, sleeping in their flesh until the world is ready." The scholar's footnote on this passage was chilling. Note: the hieroglyphic for Neteru in this context does not match standard divine terminology. It appears to be a specific designation for a separate category of being. The literal translation might be closer to those who transform, or those who are both. The text is very clear. These are not supernatural entities, but physical beings with unusual biological characteristics. Rebecca found similar patterns in Sumerian king lists, ancient Hebrew texts, and even fragments from the Indus Valley civilization. Always the same core elements: beings who looked almost human, who lived among humans, who interbred with select human lineages, who enforced strict rules about bloodline purity, who possessed biological traits that set them apart: reflective eyes, unusual skin, enhanced abilities, and always the same instruction: the blood must not be diluted. She found the most explicit reference in a section of the Book of Enoch that had been removed from most canonical versions but survived in Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. This version included chapters that Western churches had deemed too problematic to include. chapter 72, verses 14 to 19, "And the watchers made a covenant among themselves, saying, Let us preserve the blood without dilution, for the day of awakening approaches, and our children's children must be ready to receive what we have planted within them." They chose their mates with great care, testing bloodlines across generations. Those families they blessed with their seed, they also blessed with knowledge, how to maintain power across time, how to build systems that endure beyond single lives, how to recognize others of the hidden bloodline. And they said, "When the world fills with invisible fire, when the air itself carries thought, and the machines of men begin to wake, then our children will begin to remember. They will not know why they are different, only that they are. They will rise to positions of influence without understanding it is their nature to rule, and when enough of them have awakened, we will emerge from the places we have slept, and the separation between our kind and yours will end." This is not conquest, this is transformation. You're becoming what we always were. Rebecca sat back from the computer screen in the Amsterdam cafe, where she'd been working for 6 hours straight. Her coffee had gone, cold long ago. The sun had set outside without her noticing. The pattern was undeniable. Across thousands of years, across completely separate cultures that had no known contact with each other, the same story emerged. Non-human or partly human beings had interbred with select human populations. They'd done so systematically, carefully, maintaining bloodline purity across generations. They'd taught these families how to maintain power and influence, and they'd promised, or prophesied, that when humanity reached a certain level of technological development, the dormant genetic material they'd planted would activate. Their descendants would begin to wake up. Rebecca thought about the S-helix variant, the genetic marker that responded to electromagnetic frequencies, the marker that was appearing in families with documented lineages going back centuries, the marker that was activating more frequently as technology advanced, when the air itself carries thought. Wi-Fi, cellular networks, the invisible electromagnetic ocean that humanity had created in just the last few decades. When the machines of men begin to wake, artificial intelligence, neural networks, systems that learned and adapted and showed signs of genuine emergent behaviour. The ancient texts weren't prophecy, they were prediction, instructions left by beings who understood how human civilization would develop, because they designed it to develop that way. Her phone buzzed. A new email from an address she didn't recognise, archival.ghostprotocol.proton.me. The subject line, "You're looking in the right places, but you're missing the modern confirmation." The email contained a single attachment, a scanned page from what appeared to be a 1987 medical document, bearing the letterhead of a European royal family she immediately recognised. The header read, "Annual Hematological Assessment, Type S Classification." Rebecca downloaded the file, her hands shaking. The Ghost Protocol had found her, and they were feeding her exactly what she needed to know. The question was why. The 1987 document was clinically detailed and utterly damning. It described routine medical screening conducted on members of a specific aristocratic bloodline. Names redacted throughout, but the family crest visible in the top corner made their identity unmistakable to anyone familiar with European monarchy. The assessment focused on what they termed Type S hematologic differentiation, a cluster of physiological characteristics that appeared consistently across certain family members but not others. The findings were extraordinary. Stress response. Type S individuals exhibited abnormal cortisol regulation. Under extreme stress conditions, their hormone levels dropped rather than spiked, resulting in enhanced cognitive function during crisis situations. Standard fight-or-flight response was replaced by what the document termed cold clarity response. One annotation, handwritten in the margin, Subject C7 exhibited near complete emotional detachment during simulated crisis. Heart rate decreased, pupil dilation reversed, described feeling perfectly calm, like watching from outside. This is not normal stress response. Cellular regeneration. documented healing rates 40-60% faster than baseline human norms, scarring minimal or absent in most cases. One subject had recovered from a compound fracture in half, the expected time with bone density measurements showing no evidence of prior injury. The medical examiner's note: "I've been practicing orthopaedic medicine for 30 years. This is not possible. The bone structure shows remodelling that would typically take months, but occurred in weeks. Either our dating methods are wrong, or something in this subject's biology is accelerating cellular repair at rates I cannot explain. Neurological profile: near complete absence of degenerative brain disorders across 7 generations of tracking. No Alzheimer's, no Parkinson's, no dementia. Average lifespan exceeded regional norms by 12 years. Immune function: natural immunity to specific viral infections that should have no genetic basis for resistance. Several type S individuals had been exposed to influenza outbreaks that sickened entire households, but never developed symptoms themselves. Temperature regulation: baseline body temperature, sent on 1.2 degrees Celsius, lower than human average. Temperature variance under stress conditions exceeded normal human parameters. Ocular characteristics: noted unusual reflective quality to iris under specific lighting conditions. 3 subjects exhibited what the examiner described as possible nictitating membrane reflex when startled by sudden stimuli. The examiner's note on this finding: "I thought I was mistaken, but I've now observed this in 3 separate subjects. During startle response, there's a lateral movement across the eye that occurs too quickly for conscious control. It resembles the third eyelid found in reptiles and birds. This should not exist in human anatomy." The document concluded with a section titled Generational Transmission and Activation Patterns. Type S characteristics do not appear in all offspring, suggesting recessive inheritance or conditional expression. Approximately 30% of children from confirmed type S parents exhibit full phenotype. However, we have documented cases of phenotype emergence in adults who showed no signs in childhood or adolescence. This suggests the type S classification is not purely genetic in the traditional sense, but may involve activation triggers we have not yet identified. Recommend continued monitoring of type S individuals and their offspring to determine what environmental or developmental factors trigger full expression. The final note, stamped in red ink: classified, Royal Household Medical Records, unauthorized distribution prohibited. Rebecca cross-referenced the date. 1987. The same year, personal computers began entering middle-class homes across Europe and North America. The same year, cellular networks started expanding beyond experimental urban deployments. Technology. She thought about the Swiss white paper. This helix reacts to electromagnetic signals at frequencies outside standard human neural resonance. Her anonymous correspondent sent a second email while she'd been reading, "Check the 2001 leak, Phase 4. That's when they stopped monitoring and started managing." Rebecca knew exactly what that meant. In 2001, a contractor working for a US intelligence agency had leaked a series of classified briefings to a journalist who'd later died in what was officially ruled a suicide. The leaked documents had covered everything from surveillance programs to foreign policy assessments. Most had been dismissed as conspiracy theory, or redacted into meaninglessness by the time they reached public circulation. But one briefing had stuck in the collective consciousness of researchers who worked in Rebecca's field. It was titled Phase 4, Behavioural Management of Type S Infiltrates. She'd read it years ago during her doctoral research on suppressed intelligence documents, dismissed it as disinformation designed to discredit legitimate leaks. Now she pulled it up again with completely different eyes. The briefing was structured as a strategic assessment, dated March 2001, prepared for select members of a Congressional Intelligence Oversight Committee. The document had been leaked in fragments, complete pages interspersed with sections that had been redacted or destroyed. But enough remained to paint a disturbing picture. Subject: Strategic Assessment. Type S, Infiltrate Management. Classification: TS, SCI, No Fawn Executive. Summary: Phase 4 represents the transitional period during which Type S individuals embedded in positions of influence become aware of their differentiated status. Historical precedent suggests this awareness can trigger unpredictable behavioural changes and potential destabilisation of existing power structures. Unlike previous phases focused on identification and monitoring, Phase 4 requires active management protocols to ensure smooth integration of emerging Type S consciousness into existing governance and economic frameworks. Background: Type S infiltrates are not external agents or foreign operatives. They are intergenerational insertions, individuals born human but carrying genetic markers that activate under specific environmental conditions. Many Type S individuals reach adulthood, marry, raise families, and hold positions of significant influence without conscious knowledge of their differentiated status. Redacted section, approximately 2 pages, identifying characteristics, physical, variable. Most Type S individuals are phenotypically indistinguishable from baseline humans. However, activation events may trigger subtle physiological changes including altered temperature regulation, enhanced pattern recognition capabilities, abnormal stress response, decreased rather than elevated, rapid healing from injury resistance to specific pathogens. Behavioural: Type S individuals demonstrate consistent patterns across cultural and geographic boundaries, gravitate toward positions of systemic influence, policy, finance, research. Exhibit enhanced capability for long-term strategic thinking. Show reduced emotional volatility in crisis situations. Demonstrate unconscious coordination with other Type S individuals. Express feeling different or separate from baseline humans, often from early childhood. Redacted section, approximately 3 pages. Activation: Triggers. Intelligence assessment has identified 3 primary trigger categories. Technological exposure: prolonged interaction with advanced computational systems in electromagnetic environments. Correlation between Type S activation events and proximity to high-frequency electromagnetic fields exceeds 78%. Specific frequency ranges, redacted, appear to trigger genetic expression changes. Genetic awakening, proximity to other activated Type S individuals. Subjects report sensing others of their kind, though mechanism remains unclear. May involve electromagnetic sensitivity or pheromone response. Crisis response: extreme stress or survival situations that force physiological differentiation to manifest. Multiple documented cases of latent Type S individuals exhibiting enhanced capabilities during life-threatening situations, followed by partial or full awareness of their differentiated status. Phase 4: Characteristics. Phase 4 begins when a critical mass of Type S individuals become aware of their differentiated status. Current intelligence suggests we are entering Phase 4 now. Indicators include increased private communication networks among confirmed Type S individuals, formation of informal alliance structures across political and national boundaries, attempts to access classified research on S-helix genetic markers, increased interest in historical records regarding redacted strategic implications. Traditional security frameworks are inadequate for addressing emergent Type S consciousness. These individuals are not hostile foreign actors. They are embedded in critical infrastructure, political leadership, scientific research, and cultural influence positions. Many have security clearances. Some have access to classified information regarding their own status. Forceful containment or exposure strategies carry unacceptable risk. Type S individuals in intelligence positions could leak classified information. Type S individuals in policy positions could destabilize governance structures. Coordinated Type S response to persecution could trigger, redacted, public exposure, could trigger mass panic and social destabilization. Recommended management approach, Phase 4. Management should focus on controlled integration rather than containment or exposure. Objectives: monitor Type S communication networks without triggering defensive responses. Provide limited, controlled disclosure to select Type S individuals to prevent independent information gathering. Establish informal liaison protocols with cooperative Type S individuals in key positions. Prepare public for eventual broader disclosure through gradual normalization, redacted, approximately 1 page. Conclusion. Type S individuals are not the enemy. Intelligence assessment indicates their emergence serves a broader function related to species-level adaptation and technological integration. Their capabilities may prove necessary for humanity's transition to redacted. Premature exposure or forceful containment could trigger defensive protocols we are not equipped to handle. Recommend patience, observation, and strategic cooperation. Redacted section, final page. Rebecca read through the document twice, then cross-referenced it with the information she had gathered. The year the intelligence community officially acknowledged that people with the Helix variant were starting to become aware of what they were. The year the strategy shifted from monitor to manage, 24 years ago. Which meant that right now, in 2025, they were deep into Phase 4, possibly approaching Phase 5. She thought about the case studies in the genetic white paper. People who described unusual clarity and pattern recognition. People who'd said it felt like they were interfacing with code instead of just reading it. People who didn't know they were different, just knew they were unusually good at what they did. What happened when those people found out why? Rebecca opened her encrypted messaging app and sent a query to a contact she'd cultivated over years of archival work. A former intelligence analyst who'd left the NSA under circumstances that remained unclear, but who still maintained connections in the community. Her message: Phase 4, Type S. What's the current assessment? The response came back in under a minute. You're playing with fire, stop. Rebecca typed, I need to know. 3 minutes passed. Then, Phase 4 went operational in 2003. Phase 5 is already active. You don't want to know what Phase 6 looks like. Seriously, delete everything and walk away. What's Phase 5? Another long pause. Then, integration. They're not hiding anymore. Some of them know what they are, and they're starting to work together. I can't tell you more. I won't tell you more. This is me, as your friend, telling you to stop before you get disappeared like Victor. They killed him for giving you that USB drive. They'll kill you for using it. The chat went offline. Rebecca sat in the Amsterdam cafe, surrounded by ordinary people living ordinary lives, while the foundations of everything she thought she understood about human civilization crumbled beneath her. Phase 5 was active, integration. People with the S-Helix variant, people who'd been living as humans their entire lives, were waking up, becoming aware and starting to coordinate. The question wasn't whether this was happening. The documents made that clear. The question was what they wanted, and what would happen when enough of them were awake. The security footage was never supposed to exist. Rebecca found it 3 days later, buried in the anonymous file dump that had been steadily growing in her inbox. Someone was feeding her information, someone with access to materials that should have been destroyed decades ago. Someone who wanted her to know the truth, or wanted someone to know, and she was the conduit. The footage was dated August 14th, 2016. Location: a private conference facility outside Caracas, Venezuela. The context was a high-level crisis meeting involving energy ministers, military leadership, and international advisors during Venezuela's economic collapse. The meeting had been recorded using standard security cameras for standard security reasons, but someone had also been running thermal imaging equipment, likely as an additional security measure to detect concealed weapons, unauthorized personnel, or unusual heat signatures that might indicate explosive devices. That thermal equipment had recorded something that defied explanation. The footage showed exactly what you'd expect for the first 90 minutes. Human-shaped heat signatures clustered around a long conference table. Body temperatures ranging from 36.5 to 37.2 degrees Celsius. Normal human variants. People sat, stood, gestured, argued, all perfectly ordinary through the thermal camera's lens. Then, at the 1:34 to 22 mark, something changed. One attendee, seated at the head of the table, identified in the accompanying file notes as a European financial advisor to the Venezuelan government, exhibited a sudden and dramatic temperature drop. Within 45 seconds, Their surface temperature fell from 36.8 to 31.70, 5 degrees Celsius. The thermal camera clearly showed the change. The individual's heat signature shifted from warm orange-red to cool blue-green. Not gradually. Not the slow cooling that might occur if someone was in shock or hypothermic. Rapidly, deliberately. Like their body had simply decided to regulate temperature in a way that violated basic human physiology. The timestamp corresponded with a heated argument visible in the standard footage. Raised voices, accusations, the kind of high-stress confrontation that should trigger elevated heart rate, flushed skin, increased body temperature. Instead, this person's temperature had plummeted, and their body language became unnaturally calm, precise, controlled. 3 minutes later, their temperature normalized. The argument ended. The meeting continued. The file notes indicated the footage had been flagged immediately by security analysts, escalated to intelligence oversight within hours, and permanently sealed within 72 hours. The financial advisor had left Venezuela the following day and disappeared from all public records. Rebecca found a follow-up memo dated to weeks after the incident. Subject relocated to undisclosed European location. Medical evaluation confirms Type S activation event. Subject now aware of differentiated status. Recommend Phase 5 integration protocols. Subject cooperative and has agreed to voluntary monitoring in exchange for information access regarding origin and purpose of S-Helix variant. They'd made a deal. The person who'd manifested impossible physiology on camera had been given answers in exchange for cooperation. Rebecca wondered what those answers were. What did they tell people when they woke up and realised they weren't entirely human? Her anonymous source sent another compilation. This one was dozens of incident reports spanning 3 decades, all documenting similar thermal anomalies. 1991, private estate, Scotland. Security personnel report, unusual cold zones detected in the master bedroom suite despite functional heating. Thermal survey shows temperature differential of 4 degrees Celsius, concentrated around sleeping area. Estate owner, member of prominent banking family, dismisses concerns. Follow-up investigation terminated at owner's request. 1998, Manhattan penthouse. Building maintenance receives multiple complaints about HVAC malfunction in specific units. Residents report feeling overheated while thermostats register temperatures 2-3 degrees lower than surrounding apartments. Technical inspection finds no mechanical issues. Residents are all from same extended family network. Pattern noted but unexplained. 2004, Geneva Diplomatic Compound. Infrared security sweeps detect cold signatures around 3 specific individuals during high-level trade negotiations. Security team suspects equipment malfunction. Equipment tested and confirmed functional. Individuals show no signs of illness or distress. Incident classified. 2009, Dubai Financial Summit. Private security firm contracted for VIP protection reports. Unusual thermal readings on multiple attendees. Several high-profile executives register surface temperatures 1-2 degrees below expected human baseline. Firm's report submitted to clients, then immediately classified. Security team members sign expanded NDAs. 2012, London Banking District. Corporate security investigating potential industrial espionage uses thermal imaging during board meetings. Discovers 3 board members consistently register abnormally low surface temperatures during high-stress discussions. Investigation redirected by unknown authority. All thermal footage confiscated. 2016. Washington political fundraiser. Secret Service thermal scanning detects unusual temperature patterns in multiple attendees. Several prominent political figures show decreased surface temperature during public speaking and high-pressure social interactions. Anomalies noted in after-action report but not investigated further. The pattern was undeniable. These weren't equipment malfunctions. These were people whose bodies responded to stress and electromagnetic environments in ways that violated understood human biology. And then there were the eyes. Rebecca found a separate file containing compiled reports from security personnel, journalists, personal assistants, and even entertainment industry professionals. Dozens of observations, each dismissed individually, but forming an impossible pattern when viewed together. Subject's eyes reflected amber gold under camera flash, similar to animal eyeshine, assumed to be lighting artifact. Photographer, 2008. During night vision surveillance, subject's eyes showed reflective quality not consistent with human eye structure. Equipment tested and confirmed functional. Private Security Report, 2011. I could swear I saw his eyes blink sideways, like not up and down, but from the side. But that's impossible, so I must have imagined it. Political Aid, Anonymous Interview, 2015. Under UV security lighting, several VIP guests exhibited unusual iris reflection patterns. Copper or gold coloration not typical of human eyes under these conditions. Event Security Log, 2019. The senator's eyes. There was something wrong. During the press conference, when the lights hit him at a certain angle, I saw something move across his eye, horizontally. My colleague saw it too. We both pretended we didn't. Camera operator, confidential testimony. 2021, nictitating membranes. Third eyelids. Reflective tapetum lucidum like nocturnal predators possessed. Biological features that didn't exist in human anatomy, except they did, in some people, under the right conditions, when stress or environment triggered something dormant to activate. Rebecca's phone rang, actual voice call, not encrypted message. She stared at it for 3 rings before answering. "You need to stop digging." The voice was female, American accent, eerily calm. "For your own safety." Rebecca's mouth went dry. "Who is this?" "Someone who's been where you are. Someone who knows what happens when you keep pulling threads." "What happens?" A long pause. Background noise suggested the caller was outside, wind across the microphone, distant traffic. You start seeing patterns everywhere. You start questioning everyone around you. You start wondering if your boss, your neighbour, your lover, if any of them are carrying markers they don't even know about. The paranoia eats you alive, Rebecca. And the worst part... Rebecca waited, her heart hammering. The worst part is, you'll never know if you're paranoid or if you're right. Because they don't know either. Most of them live their whole lives without ever finding out what they are. They just know they're good at what they do. They just know they handle stress better than other people. They just know they see patterns others miss. And they never question it, because why would they? "Are you..." Rebecca started. "One of them?" "I don't know. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I had the test done. Private lab. Cost me $20,000 and 3 years of saved favours. You want to know what they told me?" "What?" "They told me the test was inconclusive. They told me the markers were there but dormant. They told me I might be carrying this helix variant or I might not, and there was no way to know unless it activated. And you know what that means?" Rebecca did know. "You'll never know if your successes are yours or if there's something else driving you." "Exactly. I'm a federal judge, Rebecca. I make decisions that affect millions of lives. And now I'll spend the rest of my career wondering if my judgment is mine, or if there's something in my DNA pushing me toward outcomes I don't consciously understand. That's what this knowledge does. It poisons everything. But people deserve to know. Do they? What happens when you publish your research? When you tell the world that 14 bloodlines carry non-human DNA? That some of the most powerful people in the world might be a different species and don't even know it? You think that ends well? The truth matters. The woman laughed, bitter and harsh. The truth is that whatever the seraphim were, they're woven so deep into human civilization that you can't separate us anymore. Their descendants are everywhere, in government, in corporations, in universities and hospitals and military command. And most of them are good people trying to do good work. What happens to them when you expose this? They get hunted, tested, quarantined, or worse, they get worshipped, turned into messiahs or demons. Either way, you tear society apart. Is that what you want? I want people to understand what's happening to them. Then you're naive. Victor died trying to get you this information. You think he wanted you to publish it? He wanted you to understand it, to be ready, because Phase 5 isn't about exposure, it's about preparation. Preparation for what? The line went dead. Rebecca sat in the dark of her Amsterdam hotel room, staring at thermal footage of impossible biology and witness reports of inhuman eyes, and realised she'd crossed a threshold she couldn't return from. The French intelligence analyst made contact through a dead drop in Paris. Rebecca travelled there following a coded message slipped under her hotel door. Inside a locker at Gare du Nord, she found a micro SD card and a handwritten note. What you're looking for isn't conquest, it's cultivation. A friend in the directorate. The SD card contained an audio recording, a debriefing session from 2018, conducted in French. Rebecca listened while running translation software. The speaker identified himself only as Asian Mathieu, 15 years in French foreign intelligence. Interviewer: You mentioned a rumour circulating among senior political handlers. Elaborate. Mathieu: Not discussed openly, more like shared understanding among people in these positions long enough. We all noticed patterns, officials who predict policy shifts before they happen, who navigate crises with inhuman calm, who maintain influence across administrations regardless of political changes. Interviewer: Competence could. Mathieu: Not competence, something else. A colleague, 23 years at the ministry, told me after too much wine. The Seraphim aren't here to conquer. They're here to ensure the planet evolves in a direction compatible with them. Interviewer: Compatible with what? Mathieu: That's the question. Compatible with what they are, what they're becoming. They don't interfere with democracy, they designed it, built the frameworks we operate within, not conspiracy. Architecture, like designing a garden to grow specific plants. Interviewer: You believe this? Mathieu. Pause. I believe there are people in power who think on timescales we can't fathom, working toward objectives that won't be clear for generations. Whether they're consciously aware of being different or if it's instinctive, I don't know, but the difference is real. Rebecca played it again, focusing on one phrase. They designed the systems. The helix responded to electromagnetic frequencies, appeared in bloodlines maintaining power for centuries, activated in response to technology. What if it wasn't reactive but anticipatory? What if these carriers weren't responding to technology but unconsciously driving humanity toward the thresholds that would trigger their activation? Democracy, capitalism, digital networks, AI. Every major system structuring modern civilization developed by people possibly carrying genetic programming they didn't know existed. Not conspiracy, architecture. Rebecca found the next piece, a partial transcript from a 1974 Bilderberg conference. Unknown speaker. A. The integration timeline assumes continued technological acceleration. If we encounter resistance. Unknown speaker. B. We won't. The pattern is self-reinforcing. Each generation requires more connection, more processing, more interface. They think they're choosing progress. They are, just not for the reasons they believe. Speaker A. When they realise? Speaker B. They won't. By the time enough realise, it won't matter. Systems too integrated, too essential. You can't unplug from infrastructure that keeps you alive. Speaker C. Some will resist. Speaker B. Resistance is part of the design. Creates pressure that accelerates adoption. Resistors aren't obstacles, they're catalysts. Speaker A. Very confident. Speaker B. Very patient. Not a 10-year plan, 1,000-year implementation. We designed representative government, electoral systems, the frameworks within which choice occurs. The choices themselves are irrelevant as long as the framework endures. 1,000-year implementation. Rebecca thought about ancient texts, Mesopotamian tablets describing seraphim going beneath. The instruction across cultures, preserve the bloodline. What if it never ended? What if they'd simply changed strategies, stopped ruling openly and built systems that would rule for them? Systems ensuring humanity developed exactly as needed to trigger whatever was encoded in the S-helix. Systems making their emergence not an invasion, but an awakening. Her phone buzzed. You're close. One more piece. Check your email. The email contained a single PDF. NATO Strategic Briefing Seraphim Protocol 2023 PDF. The NATO briefing was dated October 2023, marked Cosmic Top Secret. Subject: Strategic Assessment, Seraphim Protocol Activation Timeline. Executive Summary. Recent advances in AI, neural interfaces and global electromagnetic saturation have triggered measurable S-helix activation increases among monitored populations. Analysis indicates humanity is approaching technological thresholds identified in historical Seraphim documentation as return protocol initialization. Key findings: activation has increased 340% since 2020. Correlation with AI interaction, 5G deployment, and neural interfacing devices exceeds 89%. Activated individuals demonstrate enhanced pattern recognition, accelerated learning, and what subjects describe as expanded systemic awareness. Most remain unaware of physiological differentiation. Activated S-helix carriers demonstrate unconscious coordination in policy, technology investment, and social engineering. Emergent collective behaviour, not conscious conspiracy. Current rates suggest 15-20% of carriers will achieve full phenotype expression by 2030. Historical documentation suggests this represents critical threshold for return protocol completion. Historical context. Recovered Seraphim documentation indicates original departure was strategic hibernation, not retreat. Genetic architecture designed to remain dormant until humanity achieved sufficient technological sophistication for full Seraphim integration. The S-helix isn't infection, it's preparation. Strategic implications. Traditional security frameworks inadequate. Subjects embedded in critical infrastructure. Political leadership. Scientific research. Cultural influence. Born human. Raised human. Many live and die without activation. Those who activate aren't hostile. Assessment indicates Seraphim agenda aligns with long-term human survival, though definition of human may require revision. Conclusion. Humanity will reach technological thresholds in 5 to 10 years, triggering widespread S-helix activation. Enhanced AI. Brain-computer interfaces. Global neural networks. Not coincidental. These are environmental conditions Seraphim genetic architecture was designed to respond to. The briefing concluded with a final slide. There is no invasion. They are already born. They are waking up. Beneath it, recommended response. Monitor and adapt. Integration inevitable. Resistance counterproductive. Rebecca closed her laptop. Around her, people worked on devices that might be triggering something ancient in genetics, of people they'd known their entire lives. 14 bloodlines, centuries of careful breeding, systems of power immune to change. Technological acceleration everyone assumed was human progress. What if it was? What if some humans had been guiding this trajectory since the beginning? What if democracy, capitalism, technological progress, digital interconnection weren't human achievements influenced by others, but Seraphim achievements implemented through human consciousness, through people who believed themselves human until conditions awakened what had always slept inside them? Her phone buzzed. Genesis. Protocol. Verified. A proton.me. You found what Victor died to give you. Now choose. Publish and trigger panic, or wait and watch. Either way, you can't stop what's waking up. We've been waking since you invented fire, since you built cities, since you split the atom. Each threshold brings us closer to what we were always meant to become. You're not being invaded. You're being remembered. Some of us remember better than others. Soon, enough will remember. And then you'll understand. There was never separation. No aliens among you. Only humans who haven't woken yet, and humans who have. Welcome to Phase 5. Rebecca sat very still. In the corner, a woman in a business suit worked on a laptop, fingers moving with mechanical precision. In the right light, her eyes reflected copper. The woman glanced up, met Rebecca's gaze for exactly 1 second, then returned to work. Rebecca looked away, heart pounding. She opened a new document, titled it the Seraphim Program, started typing. She had no idea if anyone would believe her. No idea if publication would change anything, or if the systems were too embedded, too essential to resist. But she typed anyway, because somewhere in 14 bloodlines spread across the world, people were waking to what they'd always been. People in government, corporations, research labs. People who'd lived human lives never knowing they carried something older than civilization. People who were starting to remember, and if the briefing was correct, within a decade enough would be awake that the world would change in unpredictable ways. Maybe that's what evolution looked like. Not external invasion, but internal awakening. Not war between species, but recognition that categories were never as clear as humanity believed. Rebecca kept typing as the sun set over Paris, painting the sky copper and gold. Behind her, the woman in the business suit closed her laptop and left. Her surface temperature, had anyone been measuring, would have registered 35.9 degrees Celsius, 1 degree below normal, and falling. In boardrooms and laboratories, in government offices and university lecture halls, in hospital operating rooms and military command centres, people who'd never questioned their humanity were beginning to feel different, beginning to see patterns invisible to others, beginning to recognise each other across distances that should make recognition impossible, beginning to wake. And the systems they'd built, democracy, capitalism, technology, networks, continued functioning exactly as designed. Not as human systems influenced by hidden forces, but as seraphim systems implemented through human hands, preparing the world for a transformation that had been set in motion 4,000 years ago. Rebecca typed the final line. They are already among us. They always have been, and they are us. She hit save, encrypted the file, sent copies to 3 separate secure servers. Then she walked out into the Paris night, knowing that nothing would ever look the same again. Above her, satellites circled the Earth, transmitting signals at frequencies that made the invisible visible. And in 14 bloodlines scattered across continents, DNA that had waited millennia began to unfold, listening, responding, waking. The Seraphim Protocol was entering its final phase, and humanity, all of humanity, was about to discover what that meant.